In 1 hour, Al Gore and George W. Bush will face off against each other for the first time. Two men going 90 minutes in front of a nationally televised audience that may go as high as 90 million viewers at some point during the hour and a half. Coming as it does during an interesting time in this race, with our MSNBC, Reuters news agency, Zogby tracking poll showing Al Gore cracking through the margin of error, but just barely 46-40 against George W. Bush. Good evening to you. I'm Brian Williams. I am joined by the host of Hardball, Chris Matthews. Chris, let's get right to it. What does both guys have to do tonight in this debate?
They have to play their strengths, as any politician has to, and they have to protect their weaknesses. The strengths for Al Gore are clear. The strongest American economy, perhaps in the history of the world. He can brag about that tonight as he's never done before, and it's a good time to do that. He can also take advantage of the positions he's taken on issues which are very popular. Prescription drugs for senior citizens, college tuition tax credits for working families who have kids in college. Very strong stuff. He can sell all that tonight. George W. Bush has got to sell the fact that he's an entrepreneur. He believes in the free enterprise system. He's a Reaganite guy who believes the government does not produce jobs, the private sector does.
I know you were laughing during Hardball tonight that expectations for George W. could not be managed any lower by his surrogates.
I believe that they put out a brilliant spin tonight that the man is lucky to be able to get through tonight without drooling, when in fact he's quite capable of doing a spectacular performance tonight. Anyone who's spent any time with George Bush knows he has one big advantage over Al Gore.
Tom Brokaw as our coverage continues.
From NBC News, Decision 2000, the presidential debates. From the University of Massachusetts in Boston, here is Tom Brokaw.
Good evening, everyone. I'm here with my colleague, our Washington bureau chief and moderator of Meet the Press, Tim Russert. And Tim, on that stage right behind us tonight, Texas Governor George W. Bush and Vice President Al Gore will meet in the first of 3 debates between now and Election Day, and that's just 5 weeks away. When they walk onto that stage momentarily, the Vice President and the Governor will be facing 90 minutes of questions and rebuttals before a national television audience and an audience of their family and invited guests in this hall. We're told that Ralph Nader, the Green Party presidential candidate, has been attempting to get in here tonight on a ticket that may have been given to him by a student. We don't know whether that's been resolved yet. The candidates, their handlers, pundits, and kibitzers of all stripes have been attempting to raise expectations, lower them, second-guess them, and prejudge the outcome. But the fact is that we don't know at this point, and when it's over, you will be the judge, especially those of you who still have not settled on a candidate. The candidates have spent the weekend doing dress rehearsals with their advisors and family, going through mock debates, trying out outlines and second-guessing the opposition. The moderator, questioner tonight, Jim Lehrer of PBS, the highly respected host of the NewsHour.
Good evening from the Clark Athletic Center at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. I'm Jim Lehrer of the NewsHour on PBS, and I welcome you to the first of 3 90-minute debates between the Democratic candidate for president, Vice President Al Gore, and the Republican candidate, Governor George W. Bush of Texas. The debates are sponsored by the Commission on Presidential Debates, and they will be conducted within formats and rules agreed to by the Commission and the 2 campaigns. Tonight's will have the candidates at podiums. No answer to a question can exceed 2 minutes. Rebuttals are limited to 1 minute. But as moderator, I have the option to follow up and to extend any particular give and take another 3.5 minutes. But even then, no single answer can exceed 2 minutes. The candidates, under their rules, may not question each other directly. There will be no opening statements, but each candidate may have up to 2 minutes for a closing statement. The questions and the subjects were chosen by me alone. I have told no one from the 2 campaigns or the Commission or anyone else involved what they are. There's a small audience in the hall tonight. They are not here to participate, only to listen. I have asked and they have agreed to remain silent for the next 90 minutes, except for right now, when they will applaud as we welcome the 2 candidates, Governor Bush and Vice President Gore. And now the first question, as determined by a flip of a coin, it goes to Vice President Gore. Vice President Gore, you have questioned whether Governor Bush has the experience to be President of the United States. What exactly do you mean?
Well, Jim, first of all, I would like to thank the sponsors of this debate and the people of Boston for hosting the debate. I'd like to thank Governor Bush for participating, and I'd like to say I'm happy to be here with Tipper and our family. I have actually not questioned Governor Bush's experience. I have questioned his proposals, and here's why. I think this is a very important moment for our country. We have achieved extraordinary prosperity, and in this election, America has to make an important choice. Will we use our prosperity to enrich not just the few, but all of our families? I believe we have to make the right and responsible choices. If I'm entrusted with the presidency, here are the choices that I will make. I'll balance the budget every year. I will pay down the national debt. I will put Medicare and Social Security in a lockbox and protect them. And I will cut taxes for middle-class families. I believe it's important to resist the temptation to squander our surplus. If we make the right choices, we can have a prosperity that endures and enriches all of our people. If I'm entrusted with the presidency, I will help parents and strengthen families. Because, you know, if we have prosperity that grows and grows, we still won't be successful unless we strengthen families by, for example, ensuring that children can always go to schools that are safe, by giving parents the tools to protect their children against cultural pollution. I will make sure that we invest in our country and our families. And I mean investing in education, health care, the environment, and middle-class tax cuts and retirement security. That's my agenda, and that's why I think that it's not just a question of experience.
Governor Bush, 1 minute rebuttal.
Well, we do come from different places. I come from West Texas. I've been a governor. A governor is the chief executive officer and learns how to set agendas. And I think you're going to find the difference reflected in our budgets. I want to take 1/2 of the surplus and dedicate it to Social Security, 1/4 of the surplus for important projects, and I want to send 1/4 of the surplus back to the people who pay the bills. I want everybody who pays taxes to have their tax rates cut. Now that stands in contrast to my worthy opponent's plan, which will increase the size of government dramatically. His plan is 3 times larger than President Clinton's proposed plan 8 years ago. It's a plan that will have 200 new programs as well, or expanded programs. It'll create 20,000 new bureaucrats. In other words, it empowers Washington. And tonight you're going to hear that my passion and my vision is to empower Americans to be able to make decisions for themselves in their own lives.
So I take it by your answer then, Mr. Vice President, that in your an interview recently with the New York Times, when you said that you questioned whether or not Governor Bush was experienced enough to be president, you were talking about strictly policy differences.
Yes, Jim. I said that his tax cut plan, for example, raises the question of whether it's the right choice for the country. And let me give you an example of what I mean. Under Governor Bush's tax cut proposal, he would spend more money on tax cuts for the wealthiest 1% than all of the new spending that he proposes for education, health care, prescription drugs, and national defense all combined. Now, I think those are the wrong priorities. Now, under my proposal, for every dollar that I propose in spending for things like education and health care, I will put another dollar into middle-class tax cuts. And for every dollar that I spend in those 2 categories, I'll put $2 toward paying down the national debt. I think it's very important to keep the debt going down and completely eliminate it. And I also think it's very important to go to the next stage of welfare reform. Our country has cut the welfare rolls in half. I've fought hard from my days in the Senate and as Vice President to cut the welfare rolls, and we've moved millions of people in America into good jobs. But it's now time for the next stage of welfare reform and include fathers and not only mothers.
We're going to get to a lot of those. Yes, go ahead, Governor.
Well, let me just say that obviously tonight we're going to hear some kind of phony numbers about what I think and what we ought to do. People need to know that over the next 10 years there's going to be $25 trillion of revenue that comes into our Treasury. We anticipate spending $21 trillion. And my plan says, why don't we pass $1.3 trillion of that back to the people who pay the bill? Surely we can afford 5% of the $25 trillion that are coming to the Treasury to the hard-working people who pay the bills. There's a difference of opinion. My opponent thinks the government, the surplus is the government's money. That's not what I think. I think it's the hard-working people in America's money, and I want to share some of that money with you. So you've got more money to build and save and dream for your families. It's a difference of opinion. It's the difference between government making decisions for you and you getting more of your money to make decisions for yourself.
Jim?
So when you, let me just follow up one quick question. When you...
A lot of experience, but so do I. And I've been the chief executive officer of the second biggest state in the union. I've had a proud record of working with both Republicans and Democrats, which is what our nation needs. We need somebody who can come up to Washington and say, look, let's forget all the politics and all the finger pointing and get some positive things done on Medicare and prescription drugs and Social Security. And so I take him for his word.
Jim, if I could just
quick,
respond.
and we need to move on. Yes, sir.
I know that. The governor used the phrase phony numbers. But if you look at the plan and add the numbers up, these numbers are correct. He spends more money for tax cuts for the wealthiest 1% than all of his new spending proposals for health care, prescription drugs, education, and national defense all combined. I agree that the surplus is the American people's money. It's your money. That's why I don't think we should give nearly half of it to the wealthiest 1%, because the other 99% have had an awful lot to do with building this surplus and our prosperity.
Our 3.5 minutes is up. New question.
I hope it's about wealthy people.
Governor Bush, you have a question. This is a companion question to the question I asked Vice President Gore. You have questioned whether Vice President Gore has demonstrated the leadership qualities necessary to be President of the United States. What do you mean by that?
Well, here's what I've said, Jim. I've said that 8 years ago they campaigned on prescription drugs for seniors. And 4 years ago they campaigned on getting prescription drugs for seniors. And now they're campaigning on getting prescription drugs for seniors. It seems like they can't get it done. Now, they may blame other folks, but it's time to get somebody in Washington who's going to work with both Republicans and Democrats to get some positive things done when it comes to our seniors. And so what I've said is there's been some missed opportunities. They've had a chance. They've had a chance to form consensus. I've got a plan on Medicare, for example, this two-stage plan that says we're going to have immediate help for seniors and what I call immediate helping hand, a $48 billion program. But I also want to say to seniors, if you're happy with Medicare the way it is, fine, you can stay in the program. But we're going to give you additional choices, just like they give federal employees in the Federal Employee Health Plan. Federal employees have got a variety of choices from which to choose, so should seniors. And my point has been, as opposed to politicizing an issue like Medicare, in other words, holding it up as an issue, hoping somebody bites and then try to clobber them over the head with it for political purposes, this year, in the year 2000, it's time to say, let's get it done once and for all. And that's what I have been critical about the administration for. Same in Social Security. I think there was a good opportunity to bring Republicans and Democrats together to reform the Social Security system so the seniors will never go without. Those on Social Security today will have their promise made. But also to give younger workers the option at their choice of being able to manage some of their own money in the private sectors to make sure there's a Social Security system around tomorrow. There's a lot of young workers at our rallies we go to that when they hear that I'm going to trust them at their option to be able to manage under certain guidelines some of their own money to get a better rate of return so that they'll have a retirement plan in the future, they begin to nod their heads, and they want a different attitude in Washington.
1 minute rebuttal, Vice President Gore.
Well, Jim, under my plan, all seniors will get prescription drugs under Medicare. The governor has described Medicare as a government HMO. It's not, and let me explain the difference. Under the Medicare prescription drug proposal I'm making, here's how it works. You go to your own doctor, and your doctor chooses your prescription, and no HMO or insurance company can take those choices away from you. Then you go to your own pharmacy, you fill the prescription, and Medicare pays half the cost. If you're in a very poor family or if you have very high costs, Medicare will pay all the costs. A $25 premium and much better benefits that you can possibly find in the private sector. Now here's the contrast. 95% of all seniors would get no help whatsoever under my opponent's plan for the first 4 or 5 years. Now, one thing I don't understand, Jim, is why is it that the wealthiest 1% get their tax cuts the first year, but 95% of seniors have to wait 4 to 5 years before they get a single penny?
Governor?
I guess my answer to that is the man's running on Metascare, trying to frighten people in the voting booth. That's just not the way I think, and that's just not my intentions, and it's not my plan. I want all seniors to have prescription drugs in Medicare. We need to reform Medicare. There's been an opportunity to do so, but this administration has failed to do it. And so seniors are going to have not only a Medicare plan where the poor seniors will have their prescription drugs paid for, but there will be a variety of options. The current system today has meant a lot for a lot of seniors, and I really appreciate the intentions of the current system. And as I mentioned, if you're happy with the system, you can stay in it. But there's a lot of procedures that have not kept up in Medicare with the current times. There's no prescription drug benefits, there's no drug therapies, there's no preventing medicines, there's no vision care. I mean, we need to have a modern system to help seniors. And the idea of supporting a federally controlled 132,000-page document bureaucracy as being a compassionate way for seniors and the only compassionate source of care for seniors is just not my vision. I believe we ought to give seniors more options. I believe we ought to make the system work better. But I know this. I know it's going to require a different kind of leader to go to Washington to say to both Republicans and Democrats, let's come together. You've had your chance, Vice President. You've been there for 8 years, and nothing has been done. And my point is that my plan not only trusts seniors with options, my plan sets aside $3.4 trillion for Medicare over the next 10 years. My plan also says it's going to require a new approach in Washington, D.C. It's going to require somebody who can work across the partisan divide.
If I could respond to that, Jim, under my plan, I will put Medicare in an ironclad lockbox and prevent the money from being used for anything other than Medicare. The governor has declined to endorse that idea, even though the Republican as well as Democratic leaders of Congress have endorsed it. I'd be interested if he would this evening say that he would put Medicare in a lockbox. I don't think he will, because under his plan, if you work out the numbers, $100 billion comes out of Medicare just for the wealthiest 1% in the tax cut. Now here is the difference. Some people who say the word reform actually mean cuts. Under the governor's plan, if you kept the same fee-for-service that you have now under Medicare, your premiums would go up by between 18 and 47%, and that's the study of the congressional plan that he's modeled his proposal on by the Medicare actuaries. Let me just give you one quick example. There's a man here tonight named George McKinney from Milwaukee. He's 70 years old. He has high blood pressure. His wife has heart trouble. They have income of $25,000 a year. They cannot pay for their prescription drugs, and so they're some of the ones that go to Canada regularly in order to get their prescription drugs. Under my plan, half of their costs would be paid right away. Under Governor Bush's plan, they would get not one penny for 4 to 5 years, and then they would be forced to go into an HMO or to an insurance company and ask them for coverage, but there'd be no limit on the premiums or the deductibles or any of the terms and conditions.
I cannot let this go by, the old-style Washington politics. We're going to scare you in the voting booth. Under my plan, the man gets immediate help with prescription drugs. It's called immediate helping hand. Instead of squabbling and finger-pointing, he gets immediate help. Let me say something. Now, I understand.
Excuse me,
Jim,
our 3.5 minutes is up, but we'll finish.
Can I make one other point?
Wait a minute.
They get $25,000 a year income. That makes them ineligible.
Look, this is a man, he's got great numbers. He talks about numbers. I'm beginning to think not only did he invent the internet, but he invented the calculator. It's fuzzy math. It's trying to scare people in the voting booth. Under my tax plan that he continues to criticize, I set a third. No, the federal government should take no more than a third of anybody's check. But I also dropped the bottom rate from 15% to 10%, because by far the vast majority of the help goes to people at the bottom end of the economic ladder. If you're a family of 4 in Massachusetts making $50,000, you get a 50% cut in the federal income taxes you pay. It's from $4,000 to about $2,000. Now, the difference in our plans is I want that $2,000 to go to you.
All right,
and the Vice President would like to be spending the $2,000 on your behalf.
One quick thing, gentlemen. These are your rules. I'm doing my best. We're way over the 3.5. I have no problems with it, but do you want to have a quick response and we'll move on? We're already to almost 5 minutes on this.
Yeah,
all right?
I mean, it's just clear. You can go to the website and look. If you make more than $25,000 a year, you don't get a penny of help under the Bush prescription drug proposal for at least 4 to 5 years. And then you're pushed into a Medicare, into an HMO or an insurance company plan. And there's no limit on the premiums or the deductibles or any of the conditions. And the insurance companies say it won't work and they won't offer these plans.
Let me ask you both this and we'll move on this subject. As a practical matter, both of you want to bring prescription drugs to seniors, correct?
Correct, but the difference is I want to bring it to 100%, and he brings it only to 5%.
That's just totally false. Wait a minute, it's just totally false for him to stand up here and say that. Let me make sure the seniors hear me loud and clear. They've had their chance to get something done. I'm going to work with both Republicans and Democrats to reform the system. All seniors will be covered. All poor seniors will have their prescription drugs paid for. In the meantime, we're going to have a plan to help poor seniors. And in the meantime, could be 1 year or 2 years.
Okay.
I don't know.
Let me call your attention to the key word there. He said all poor seniors.
No, wait a minute. All seniors are covered under prescription drugs in my plan.
In the first year?
If we can get it done in the first year, you bet. Yours is phased in 8 years.
No, it's a 2-phase plan, Jim, and for the first 4 years, it takes a year to pass it, and then for the first 4 years, only the poor are covered. Middle-class seniors, like George McKinney and his wife, are not covered for 4 to 5 years.
I've got an idea.
Okay.
If you have any more to say about this, you can say it in your closing statements. We'll move on, okay? New question. Vice President Gore, how would you contrast your approach to preventing future oil price and supply problems like we have now to the approach of Governor Bush?
Excellent question, and here's the simple difference. My plan has not only a short-term component, but also a long-term component. And it focuses not only on increasing the supply, which I think we have to do, but also on working on the consumption side. Now, in the short term, we have to free ourselves from the domination of the big oil companies that have the ability to manipulate the price, from OPEC when they want to raise the price. And in the long term, we have to give new incentives for the development of domestic resources like deep gas in the Western Gulf, like stripper wells for oil, but also renewable sources of energy and domestic sources that are cleaner and better. And I'm proposing a plan that will give tax credits and tax incentives for the rapid development of new kinds of cars and trucks and buses and factories and boilers and furnaces that don't have as much pollution, that don't burn as much energy, and that help us get out on the cutting edge of the new technologies that will create millions of new jobs, because when we sell these new products here, we'll then be able to sell them overseas, and there's a ravenous demand for them overseas. Now, another big difference is Governor Bush is proposing to open up some of our most precious environmental treasures, like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, to the big oil companies to go in and start producing oil there. I think that is the wrong choice. It would only give us a few months' worth of oil, and the oil wouldn't start flowing for many years into the future. And I don't think it's a fair price to pay to destroy precious parts of America's environment. We have to bet on the future and move beyond the current technologies to have a whole new generation of more efficient, cleaner energy technologies.
Governor Bush, 1 minute.
Well, it's an issue I know a lot about. I was a small oil person for a while in West Texas. This is an administration that's had no plan. And all of a sudden, The results of having no plan have caught up with America. First and foremost, we got to make sure we fully fund LIHEAP, which is a way to help low-income folks, particularly here in the East, pay for their high fuel bills. Secondly, we need an active exploration program in America. The only way to become less dependent on foreign sources of crude oil is to explore at home. And you bet I want to open up a small part of Alaska, because when that field is online, it will produce 1 million barrels a day. Today, we import 1 million barrels from Saddam Hussein. I would rather that 1 million come from our own hemisphere, our own country, as opposed from Saddam Hussein. I want to build more pipelines to move natural gas throughout this hemisphere. I want to develop the coal resources in America and have clean coal technologies. We've got abundant supplies of energy here in America, and we better get after it and better start exploring it. Otherwise, we're going to be in deep trouble in the future because of our dependency upon foreign sources of crude.
So, if somebody is watching tonight, listening to what the two of you just said, is it fair to say, okay, the differences between Vice President Gore and George W. Bush, Governor Bush, are the following? You are for doing something on the consumption end, you're for doing something on the production and drilling?
Let me clarify. I'm for doing something both on the supply side and production side and on the consumption side. And let me say that I found one thing in Governor Bush's answer that we certainly agree on, and that's the low-income heating assistance program, and I commend you for supporting that. I worked to get $400 million just a couple of weeks ago, and to establish a permanent home heating oil reserve here in the Northeast. Now, as for the proposals that I've worked for renewables and conservation and efficiency and the new technologies, the fact is, for the last few years in the Congress, we've faced a lot of opposition to them. They've only approved about 10% of the agenda that I've helped to send up there. And I think that we need to get serious about this energy crisis, both in the Congress and in the White House. And if you entrust me with the presidency, I will tackle this problem and focus on new technologies that will make us less dependent on big oil or foreign oil.
How would you draw the difference?
Well, I would first say that he should have been tackling it for the last 7 years. Yep. And secondly, the difference is that we need to explore at home. And the Vice President doesn't believe in exploration, for example, in Alaska. There's a lot of shut-in gas that we need to be moving out of Alaska by pipeline. There's an interesting issue up in the Northwest as well, and that is whether or not we remove dams that produce hydroelectric energy. I'm against removing dams in the Northwest. I don't know where the Vice President stands, but that's a renewable source of energy we need to keep in line. I was in coal country yesterday in West Virginia. There's an abundant supply of coal in America. I know we can do a better job of clean coal technologies. I'm going to ask the Congress for $2 billion to make sure that we have the cleanest coal technologies in the world. My answer to you is that in the short term, we need to get after it here in America. We need to explore our resources, and we need to develop our reservoirs of domestic production. We also need to have a hemispheric energy policy where Canada and Mexico and the United States come together. I brought this up recently with Vicente Fox, who's the newly elected president. He's a man I know from Mexico, and I talked about how best to be able to expedite the exploration of natural gas in Mexico and transport it up to the United States so we become less dependent on foreign sources of crude oil. This is a major problem facing America. The administration did not deal with it. It's time for a new administration to deal with the energy problem.
If I just briefly, Jim, I know I found a couple of other things that we agree on, and we may not find that many this evening, so I wanted to emphasize them. I strongly support new investments in clean coal technology. I made a proposal 3 months ago on this, and also domestic exploration, yes, but not in the environmental treasures of our country. We don't have to do that. That's the wrong choice. I know the oil companies have been itching to do that, but it is not the right thing for the future.
No, it's the right thing for the consumers. Less dependency upon foreign sources of crude is good for consumers, and we can do so in an environmentally friendly way.
Well, can I have the last word on this?
New question.
Of course.
Okay,
new question, new subject.
All right.
Governor Bush, if elected president, would you try to overturn the FDA's approval last week of the abortion pill RU-486?
I don't think a president can do that. I was disappointed in the ruling because I think abortions ought to be more rare in America. And I'm worried that that pill will create more abortion, will cause more people to have abortions. This is a very important topic, and it's a very sensitive topic because a lot of good people disagree on the issue. I think what the next president ought to do is to promote a culture of life in America, is the life of the elderly and life of those living all across the country, life of the unborn. As a matter of fact, I think a noble goal for this country is that every child, born and unborn, ought to be protected in law and welcomed into life. But I know we got to change a lot of minds before we get there in America. What I do believe is we can find good common ground on issues like parental notification or parental consent. And I know we need to ban partial birth abortions. This is a place where my opponent and I have strong disagreements. That I believe banning partial birth abortion would be a positive step toward reducing the number of abortions in America. This is an issue that's going to require a new attitude. We've been battling over abortion for a long period of time. Surely this nation can come together to promote the value of life. Surely we can fight off these laws that will encourage doctors to allow doctors to take the lives of our seniors. Surely we can work together to create a culture of life so some of these youngsters who feel like they can take a neighbor's life with a gun will understand that that's not the way America is meant to be. And surely we can find common ground to reduce the number of abortions in America. As to the drug itself, I mentioned I was disappointed. I hope the FDA took its time to make sure that American women will be safe who use this drug.
Vice President Gore.
Well, Jim, the FDA took 12 years, and I do support that decision. They determined it was medically safe for the women who use that drug. Now, this is indeed a very important issue. First of all, on the issue of partial birth or so-called late-term abortion, I would sign a law banning that procedure, provided that doctors have the ability to save a woman's life or to act if her health is severely at risk. And that's not the main issue. The main issue is whether or not the Roe v. Wade decision is going to be overturned. I support a woman's right to choose. My opponent does not. It is important because the next president is going to appoint 3, maybe even 4 justices of the Supreme Court. And Governor Bush has declared to the anti-choice groups that he will appoint justices in the mold of Scalia and Clarence Thomas, who are known for being the most vigorous opponents of a woman's right to choose. Here's the difference. He trusts the government to order a woman to do what it thinks she ought to do. I trust women to make the decisions that affect their lives, their destinies, and their bodies. And I think a woman's right to choose ought to be protected and defended.
Governor, we'll go to the Supreme Court question in a moment, but make sure I understand your position on RU 486. If you're elected president, will you, not through appointments to the FDA, you won't support legislation to overturn this? I
don't think a president can unilaterally overturn it. I think the FDA's made its decision.
But it means you wouldn't through appointments to the FDA and ask them to reappraise it?
I think once the decision's made, it's been made. Now, unless it's proven to be unsafe to women.
Right. Well, Jim, you know, the question you asked, if I heard you correctly, was would he support legislation to overturn it? And if I heard the statement day before yesterday, you said you would order, he said he would order his FDA appointee to review the decision. And now that sounds to me a little bit different, and I just think that we ought to support the decision.
I said I would make sure that that women would be safe who use the drug.
All right, on the Supreme Court question, should a voter assume, you're pro-life, you just stated your position. Should a voter assume that all judicial appointments you make to the Supreme Court or any other court, federal court, will also be pro-life?
Voters should assume that I have no litmus test on that issue or any other issue. But the voters will know I'll put competent judges on the bench, people who will strictly interpret the Constitution and will not use the bench to write social policy. And that's going to be a big difference between my opponent and me. I believe that the judges ought not to take the place of the legislative branch of government, that they're appointed for life, and that they ought to look at the Constitution as sacred. They shouldn't misuse their bench. I don't believe in liberal activist judges. I believe in strict constructionists, and those are the kind of judges I will appoint. I've named 4 Supreme Court judges in the state of Texas, and I would ask the people to check out their qualifications, their deliberations. They're good, solid men and women who have made good, sound judgments on behalf of the people of Texas.
What kind of appointment should they expect from you?
Both of us use similar language to reach an exactly opposite outcome. I don't favor litmus tests, but I know that there are ways to assess how a potential justice interprets the Constitution. And in my view, the Constitution ought to be interpreted as a document that grows with our country and our history. And I believe, for example, that there is a right of privacy in the Fourth Amendment. And when the phrase strict constructionist is used, and when the names of Scalia and Thomas are used as benchmarks for who would be appointed, those are code words, and nobody should mistake this, for saying that the governor would appoint people who would overturn Roe v. Wade. I mean, it's very clear to me, and I would appoint people who have a philosophy that I think would make it quite likely that they would uphold Roe v. Wade.
Is the Vice President right? Is that a code word for overturning Roe v. Wade?
Sounds like the Vice President's not very right many times tonight. I've just told you the criterion in which I'll appoint judges. I've had a record of appointing judges in the state of Texas. That's what a governor gets to do. A governor gets to name Supreme Court judges, and I've given him my answer. He also reads all kinds of things into my tax plan, into my Medicare plan, and I just want the viewers out there to listen to what I have to say about it.
That's a yes.
Reverse the question. Reverse the question. What code phrases should we read by what you said about what kind of people you will appoint to the U.S.
It would be very likely that they'd uphold Roe v. Wade, but I do believe it's wrong to use a litmus test. But if you look at the history of a lower court judge's rulings, you can get a pretty good idea of how they're going to interpret questions. Now, a lot of questions are of first impression, and these questions that have been seen many times come up in a new context, and so. But, you know, this is a very important issue because a lot of young women in this country take this right for granted, and it could be lost. It is on the ballot in this election. Make no mistake about it.
I'll tell you what kind of judges he'll put on there. He'll put liberal, activist judges who will use their bench to subvert the legislature. That's what he'll do.
That's not right.
New subject, new question. Vice President Gore, if President Milosevic of Yugoslavia refuses to accept the election results and leave office, what action, if any, should the United States take to get him out of there?
Well, Milosevic has lost the election. His opponent, Kostunica, has won the election. It's overwhelming. Milosevic's government refuses to release the vote count. There's now a general strike going on. They're demonstrating. I think we should support the people of Serbia and the Yugoslavia, as they call Serbia plus Montenegro, and put pressure in every way possible to recognize the lawful outcome of the election. The people of Serbia have acted very bravely in kicking this guy out of office. Now he is trying to not release the votes and then go straight to a so-called runoff election without even announcing the results of the first vote. Now, we've made it clear, along with our allies, that when Milosevic leaves, then Serbia will be able to have a more normal relationship with the rest of the world. That is a very strong incentive that we have given them to do the right thing. Bear in mind also, Milosevic has been indicted as a war criminal, and he should be held accountable for his actions. Now, we have to take measured steps because the sentiment within Serbia is, for understandable reasons, still against the United States because their nationalism has led, even if they don't like Milosevic, they still have some feelings lingering from the NATO action there. So we have to be intelligent in the way we go about it. But make no mistake about it, we should do everything we can to see that the will of the Serbian people expressed in this extraordinary election is done. And I hope that he'll be out of office very shortly.
Governor Bush, 1 minute.
Well, I'm pleased with the results of the election. As Vice President is, it's time for the man to go. And it means that the United States must have a strong diplomatic hand with our friends in NATO. That's why it's important to make sure our alliances are as strong as they possibly can be to keep the pressure on Mr. Milosevic. But this will be an interesting moment for the Russians to step up and lead as well. It'll be a wonderful time for the President of Russia to step into the Balkans and convince Mr. Milosevic it's in his best interest and his country's best interest to leave office. The Russians have got a lot of sway in that part of the world, And we'd like to see them use that sway to encourage democracy to take hold. And so it's an encouraging election. It's time for the man to leave.
But what if he doesn't leave, Mr. Vice? What if all the things, all the diplomatic efforts, all the pressure from all over the world, and he still doesn't go? Is this the kind of thing, to be specific, that you as president would consider the use of U.S. military force to get him gone?
In this particular situation, no. Bear in mind that we have a lot of sanctions in force against Serbia right now. And the people of Serbia know that they can escape all those sanctions if this guy is turned out of power. Now, I understand what the governor has said about asking the Russians to be involved, and under some circumstances that might be a good idea. But being as they have not yet been willing to recognize Kostunica as the lawful winner of the election, I'm not sure that it's right for us to invite the president of Russia to mediate this dispute there, because we might not like the result that comes out of that. They currently favor going forward with a runoff election. I think that's the wrong thing. I think the governor's instinct is not necessarily bad, because we have worked with the Russians in a constructive way in Kosovo, for example, to end the conflict there. But I think we need to be very careful in the present situation before we invite the Russians to play the lead role in mediating.
Well, obviously we wouldn't use the Russians if they didn't agree with our answer, Mr. Vice President.
Well, they don't.
But let me say this to you. I wouldn't use force. I wouldn't use force.
You wouldn't use force?
No.
Why not?
Because it's not in our national interest to use force in this case. I would keep pressure. I would use diplomacy. There's a difference between what the president did, who I supported, in Kosovo, and this. And this is up for the people in this region to figure out how to take control of their country.
New question. How would you go about, as president, deciding when it was in the national interest to use U.S. force, generally?
Well, if it's in our vital national interests, and that means whether or not our territory, our territory is threatened, our people could be harmed, whether or not our alliances, our defense alliances are threatened, whether or not our friends in the Middle East are threatened, that would be a time to seriously consider the use of force. Secondly, whether or not the mission was clear, whether or not it was a clear understanding as to what the mission would be. Thirdly, whether or not we were prepared and trained to win, whether or not our forces were of high morale and high standing and well equipped. And finally, whether or not there was an exit strategy. I would take the use of force very seriously. I would be guarded in my approach. I don't think we can be all things to all people in the world. I think we got to be very careful when we commit our troops. The Vice President and I have a disagreement about the use of troops. He believes in nation building. I would be very careful about using our troops as nation builders. I believe the role of the military is to fight and win war, and therefore prevent war from happening in the first place. And so I take my responsibility seriously. And it starts with making sure we rebuild our military power. Morale in today's military is too low. We're having trouble meeting recruiting goals. We met the goals this year, but in the previous years we have not met recruiting goals. Some of our troops are not well equipped. I believe we're overextended in too many places. And therefore I want to rebuild the military power. It starts with a $1 billion pay raise for the men and women who wear the uniform, $1 billion more than the President recently signed into law. It's to make sure our troops are well housed and well equipped, bonus plans to keep some of our high-skilled folks in the services, and a commander-in-chief who clearly sets the mission. And the mission is to fight and win war, and therefore prevent war from happening in the first place.
Vice President Gore, 1 minute.
Let me tell you what I'll do. First of all, I want to make it clear, our military is the strongest, best trained, best equipped, best led fighting force in the world and in the history of the world. Nobody should have any doubt about that, least of all our adversaries or potential adversaries. If you entrust me with the presidency, I will do whatever is necessary in order to make sure our forces stay the strongest in the world. In fact, in my 10-year budget proposal, I have set aside more than twice as much for this purpose as Governor Bush has in his proposal. Now, I think we should be reluctant to get involved in some place in a foreign country. But if our national security is at stake, if we have allies, if we've tried every other course, if we're sure military action will succeed, and if the costs are proportionate to the benefits, we should get involved. Now, just because we don't want to get involved everywhere, doesn't mean we should back off anywhere it comes up. And I disagree with the proposal that maybe only when oil supplies are at stake then our national security is at risk. I think that there are situations like in Bosnia or Kosovo where there's a genocide where our national security is at stake there.
Governor.
I agree that our military is the strongest in the world today. That's not the question. The question is, it will be the strongest in years to come. And the warning signs are real. Everywhere I go around the campaign trail, I see people moms and dads whose son or daughter may wear the uniform, and they tell me about how discouraged their son or daughter may be. If a recent poll was taken amongst 1,000 enlisted personnel, as well as officers, over half of whom are going to leave the service when their time of enlistment is up. The captains are leaving the service. There is a problem, and it's going to require a new commander-in-chief to rebuild the military power. The other day, I was honored to be flanked by Colin Powell and General Norman Schwarzkopf, who stood by my side and agreed with me. They said we can, even though we're the strongest military, that if we don't do something quickly, if we don't have a clearer vision of the military, if we don't stop extending our troops all around the world in nation-building missions, then we're going to have a serious problem coming down the road, and I'm going to prevent that. I'm going to rebuild our military power. It's one of the major priorities of my administration.
Vice President Gore, how should the voters go about deciding which one of you is better suited to make the kinds of decisions we've been told, whether it's Milosevic or whether it's whatever, in the military and foreign policy area?
Well, they should look at our proposals and look at us as people and make up their own minds. When I was a young man, I volunteered for the Army. I served my country in Vietnam. My father was a senator who strongly opposed the Vietnam War. I went to college in this great city, and most of my peers felt against the war as I did. But I went anyway, because I knew if I didn't, somebody else in the small town of Carthage, Tennessee, would have to go in my place. I served for 8 years in the House of Representatives, and I served on the Intelligence Committee, specialized in looking at arms control. I served for 8 years in the United States Senate and served on the Armed Services Committee. For the last 8 years, I've served on the National Security Council. And when the conflict came up in Bosnia, I saw a genocide in the heart of Europe, with the most violent war on the continent of Europe since World War II. Look, that's where World War I started, in the Balkans. My uncle was a victim of poison gas there. Millions of Americans saw the results of that conflict. We have to be willing to make good, sound judgments. And incidentally, I know the value of making sure our troops have the latest technology. The governor's proposed skipping the next generation of weapons. I think that's a big mistake, because I think we have to stay at the cutting edge.
Governor, how would you advise the voters to make the decision on this issue?
I think you've got to look at how one has handled responsibility in office. Whether or not, it's the same in domestic policy as well, Jim, whether or not you've got the capacity to convince people to follow. Whether or not one makes decisions based upon sound principles, or whether or not you rely upon polls and focus groups on how to decide what the course of action is. We've got too much polling and focus groups going on in Washington today. We need decisions made on sound principles. I've been the governor of a big state. I think one of the hallmarks of my relationship in Austin, Texas is that I've had the capacity to work with both Republicans and Democrats. I think that's an important part of leadership. I think what it means to build consensus. I've shown I know how to do so. As a matter of fact, tonight in the audience, there's one elected state senator who's a Democrat, a former state rep who's a Democrat, one statewide officer who's a Democrat. I mean, there's a lot of Democrats who are here in the debate.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Because they want to show their support that shows I know how to lead. And so the fundamental answer to your question, who can lead and who has shown the ability to get things done?
If I could say one other thing.
We're way over the 3.5 minutes. Go ahead.
I think one of the key points in foreign policy and national security policy is the need to reestablish the old-fashioned principle that politics ought to stop at the water's edge. When I was in the United States Congress, I worked with former President Reagan to modernize our strategic weaponry and to pursue arms control in a responsible way. When I was in the United States Senate, I worked with former President Bush, your father, and was one of only a few Democrats in the Senate to support the Persian Gulf War. I think bipartisanship is a national asset, and we have to find ways to reestablish it in foreign policy and national security policy.
In a word, do you have a problem with that?
Yeah, why haven't they done it in 7 years?
New subject, new question. Should the voters of this election, Vice President Gore, see this on domestic area, in the domestic area, as a major choice between competing political philosophies?
Oh, absolutely. This is a very important moment in the history of our country. Look, we've got the biggest surpluses in all of American history. Well, the key question that has to be answered in this election is, will we use that prosperity wisely in a way that benefits all of our people and doesn't go just to the few? Almost half of all the tax cut benefits, as I said, under Governor Bush's plan, go to the wealthiest 1%. I think we have to make the right and responsible choices. I think we have to invest in education, protecting the environment, health care, a prescription drug benefit that goes to all seniors, not just to the poor, under Medicare, not relying on HMOs and insurance companies. I think that we have to help parents and strengthen families by dealing with the kind of inappropriate entertainment material that families are just heartsick that their children are exposed to. I think we have got to have welfare reform taken to the next stage. I think that we have got to balance the budget every single year, pay down the national debt, and in fact, under my proposal, the national debt will be completely eliminated by the year 2012. I think we need to put Medicare and Social Security in a lockbox. The governor will not put Medicare in a lockbox. I don't think it should be used as a piggy bank for other programs. I think it needs to be moved out of the budget and protected. I'll veto anything that takes money out of Social Security or Medicare for anything other than Social Security or Medicare. Now, the priorities are just very different. I'll give you a couple of examples. For every new dollar that I propose for spending on health care, Governor Bush spends $3 for a tax cut for the wealthiest 1%. Now, for every dollar that I propose to spend on education, he spends $5 on a tax cut for the wealthiest 1%. Those are very clear differences.
Governor, 1 minute.
Man's practicing fuzzy math again. There's differences. Under Vice President Gore's plan, he's going to grow the federal government in the largest increase since Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1965. And we're talking about a massive government, folks. We're talking about adding to or increasing 200 new programs, 200 programs, 20,000 new bureaucrats. Imagine how many IRS agents it's going to take to be able to figure out his targeted tax cut for the middle class that excludes 50 million Americans. There is a huge difference in this campaign. He says he's going to give you tax cuts. 50 million of you won't receive it. He said in his speech he wants to make sure the right people get tax relief. That's not the role of a president to decide right and wrong. Everybody who pays taxes ought to get tax relief. After my plan is in place, the wealthiest Americans will pay a higher percentage of taxes than they do today. And the poorest of Americans, 6 million families, 7 million people, won't pay any tax at all. It is a huge difference. It's the difference between big, exploding federal government that wants to think on your behalf and a plan that meets priorities and liberates working people to be able to make decisions on your own.
Let me just say, Jim, you haven't heard the governor deny these numbers. He's called them phony, he's called them fuzzy, but the fact remains, almost 30% of his proposed tax cut goes only to Americans that make more than $1 million per year. More money goes to the... Can I have a rebuttal here?
Sure, but I just want to see if he buys that.
No, let me just tell you what the facts are. The facts are, after my plan, the wealthiest of Americans pay more taxes of the percentage of the whole than they do today. Secondly, if you're a family of 4 making $50,000 in Massachusetts, you get a 50% tax cut. Let me give you one example. The Strunk family in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I campaigned with them the other day. They make $51,000 combined income. They pay about $3,800 in taxes, or $3,500 in taxes. Under my plan, they get $1,800 of tax relief. Under Vice President Gore's plan, they give $145 of tax relief. Now, you tell me who stands on the side of the rich. You ask the Strunks. You ask the Strunks.
If I could get my
whose plan it makes more sense, and there's a difference of opinion. He would rather spend the Strunks $1,800, and I would rather the Strunks spend your own money.
You see it that way, Vice President?
No, I don't, and I'm not going to go to calling names on his facts. I'm just going to tell you what the real facts are. The analysis that he's talking about leaves out more than half of the tax cuts that I have proposed. And if you just add the numbers up, he still hasn't denied it. He spends more money on a tax cut for the wealthiest 1% than all of his new proposals for prescription drugs, health care, education, and national defense combined. Now, those are the wrong priorities. $665 billion over 10 years for the wealthiest 1%. Now, and as I said, almost 30% of it goes to Americans that make more than $1 million per year. Every middle-class family is eligible for a tax cut under my proposal. Let me give you some specific examples. I believe that college tuition up to $10,000 a year ought to be tax deductible so middle-class families can choose to send their children to college. I believe that all seniors should be able to choose their own doctors and get prescription drugs from their own pharmacists, with Medicare paying half the bill. I believe that parents ought to have more choices with charter schools and public school choice to send their kids always to a safe school. I think we need to make education the #1 priority in our country and treat teachers like the professionals that they are, and that's why I have made it the #1 priority in my budget, not a tax cut for the wealthy.
Yeah, let me talk about tax cuts one more time. This is a man whose plan excludes 50 million Americans.
Not so.
He doesn't believe that, well, take, for example, the marriage penalty. If you itemize your tax return, you get no marriage penalty relief. He picks and chooses. He decides who the right people are. It's a fundamental difference of opinion. I want my fellow Americans to hear one more time. We're going to spend $25 trillion. We're going to collect $25 trillion of revenue over the next 10 years. And we're going to project it to spend $21 trillion. Now, surely we can send 5% of that back to you all who pay the bills. There is a problem. I want to say something, Jim. Wait a minute. Okay. This man's been disparaging my plan with all this Washington fuzzy math. I want you to hear a problem we've got in America. If you're a single mother making $22,000 a year and you've got 2 children, under this tax code, for every additional dollar you make, you pay a higher marginal rate on that dollar than someone making $200,000 a year, and that is not right. And so my plan drops the rate from 15% to 10% and increases the child credit from $500 to $1,000 to make the code more fair for everybody, not just a few, not just, you know, a handful. Everybody who pays taxes ought to get some relief.
All right, having cleared that up, we're going to a new question. Education. Governor Bush, both of you have promised dramatically to change dramatically public education in this country. But of the public money spent on education, only 6% of it is federal money.
Right.
You want to change 100% of public education with 6% of the money. Is that possible?
Well, I tell you, we can make a huge difference by saying if you receive federal money, we expect you to show results. Let me give you a story about public ed, if I might, Jim. It's about KIPP Academy in Houston, Texas. It's a charter school run by some people from Teach for America. Young folks that said, well, I'm going to do something good for my country. I want to teach. A guy named Michael runs the school. It's a school full of so-called at-risk children. So it's how we unfortunately label certain children. It means basically they can't learn. It's a school of strong discipline and high standards. It's one of the best schools in Houston. And here are the key ingredients: high expectations, strong accountability. What Michael says is, don't put all these rules on us. Just let us teach and hold us accountable for every grade. And that's what we do. And as a result, these young, mainly Hispanic youngsters, are some of the best learners in Houston, Texas. That's my vision for public education. all around America. Many of you viewers don't know, but Laura and I sent our girls to public school. We went to Austin High School, and many of the public schools are meeting the call. But unfortunately, a lot of schools are trapping children in schools that just won't teach and won't change. So here's the role of the federal government. One is to change Head Start into a reading program. Two is to say that if you want to access reading money, you can do so, because the goal is for every single child to learn to read. There must be K-2 diagnostic tools. There's teacher training money available. Three, we've got to consolidate federal programs to free districts, to free the schools, to encourage innovators like Michael, to let schools reach out beyond the confines of the current structure to recruit teach for the children type teachers. Four, we're going to say, if you receive federal money, measure 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, and show us whether or not children are learning to read and write and add and subtract, and if so, there'll be a bonus plan. But if not, instead of continuing to subsidize failure, the money will go to the parents, so the parent can choose a different public school. The federal money attributed to the child will go to the parent for public school or charter school or tutorial or Catholic school. What I care about is children, and so does Michael Feinberg. And you know what? It can happen in America with the right kind of leadership.
Vice President Gore?
Look, we agree on a couple of things on education. I strongly support new accountability, so does Governor Bush. I strongly support local control, so does Governor Bush. I'm in favor of testing as a way of measuring performance. Every school district, have every state test the children. I've also proposed a voluntary national test in the 4th grade and 8th grade. And a form of testing that the governor has not endorsed. I think that all new teachers ought to be tested, including in the subjects that they teach. We've got to recruit 100,000 new teachers, and I have budgeted for that. We've got to reduce the class size so that the student who walks in has more one-on-one time with the teacher. We ought to have universal preschool, and we ought to make college tuition tax deductible up to $10,000 a year. I'd like to tell you a quick story. I got a letter today as I left Sarasota, Florida. I'm here with a group of 13 people from around the country who helped me prepare, and we had a great time. But 2 days ago, we ate lunch at a restaurant, and the guy who served us lunch got me a letter today. His name is Randy Ellis. He has a 15-year-old daughter named Kaylee, who's in Sarasota High School. Her science class was supposed to be for 24 students. She is the 36th student in that classroom. Sent me a picture of her in the classroom. They can't squeeze another desk in for her, so she has to stand during class. I want the federal government, consistent with local control and new accountability, to make improvement of our schools the #1 priority, so Kaylee will have a desk and can sit down in a classroom where she can learn.
All right. So, having heard the two of you, voters have just heard the two of you, what's the difference? What's the choice between the two of you on education?
Well, the difference is there is no new accountability measures in Vice President Gore's plan. He says he's for voluntary testing. You can't have voluntary testing. You must have mandatory testing. You must say that if you receive money, you must show us whether or not children are learning to read and write and add and subtract. That's the difference. You may claim you've got mandatory testing, but you don't, Mr. Vice President, and that is a huge difference. Testing is the cornerstone of reform. You know how I know? Because it's the cornerstone of reform in the state of Texas. Republicans and Democrats came together and asked the question, what can we do to make our public education the best in the country? And we've done a long way working together to do so. And the cornerstone is to have strong accountability in return for money and in return for flexibility. We're going to ask you to show us whether or not, and we ask to post the results on the internet. We encourage parents to take a look at the comparative results of schools. We've got a strong charter school movement that I signed the legislation to get started in the state of Texas. I believe if we find poor children trapped in schools that won't teach, we need to free the parents. I think we need to expand education savings accounts. It's something Vice Presidential running mate supports. No, there's big differences of opinion. He won't support freeing local districts from the strings of federal money.
All right. How do you see the differences?
Well, first of all, I do have mandatory testing. I think the governor may not have heard what I said clearly. The voluntary national test is in addition to the mandatory testing that we require of states, all schools, all school districts, students themselves, and required teacher testing, which goes a step farther than Governor Bush has been willing to go. Here are a couple of differences, though, Jim. Governor Bush is in favor of vouchers, which take taxpayer money away from public schools and give them to private schools that are not accountable for how the money is used and don't have to take all applicants. Now, private schools play a great role in our society. All of our children have gone to both public schools and private schools. But I don't think private schools should have a right to take taxpayer money away from public schools at a time when Kaylee Ellis is standing in that classroom. Let me give you another example. I went to a school in Dade County, Florida, where the facilities are so overcrowded, the children have to eat lunch in shifts, with the first shift for lunch starting at 9:30 in the morning. Look, this is a funding crisis all around the country. There are fewer parents of school-aged children in the vote as a percentage of the voting population, and there's the largest generation of students ever. We're in an information age when learning is more important than ever. 90% of our kids go to public schools. We have to make it the #1 priority. Modernize our schools, reduce the class size, recruit new teachers, give every child a chance to learn with one-on-one time in a quality, high-quality, safe school. If it's a failing school, shut it down and reopen it under a new principal with a turnaround team of specialists the way Governor Jim Hunt does in North Carolina. Here's another difference. The governor, if it's a failing school, would leave the children in that failing school for 3 years and then give a little bit of money to the parents, a down payment on a down payment for private school tuition, and pretend that that would be enough for them to go out and go to a private school. It's an illusion.
Well, wait a minute. 30 seconds, Governor. Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. First of all, most good governance is at the state level. See, here's the mentality. I'm going to make the state do this. I'm going to make the state do that. All I'm saying is if you spend money, show us results, and test every year, which you do not do, Mr. Vice President. You do not test every year. You can say you do into cameras, but you don't, unless you've changed your plan here on the stage. Secondly, and you need to test every year, because that's where you determine whether or not children are progressing to excellence. Secondly, one of the things that we've got to be careful about in politics is throwing money at a system that has not yet been reformed. More money is needed, and I spend more money. But step one is to make sure we reform the system, to have the system in place that leaves no child behind, to stop this business about asking, gosh, how old are you? If you're 10, we're going to put you here. If we're 12, we'll put you here. And start asking the question, what do you know? And if you don't know what you're supposed to know, we'll make sure you do early before it is too late.
New question. We've been talking about a lot of specific issues. It's often said that in the final analysis, about 90% of being the President of the United States is dealing with the unexpected, not with issues that came up in the campaign. Vice President Gore, can you point to a decision, an action you have taken that illustrates your ability to handle the unexpected, the crisis under fire, etc.?
When the action in Kosovo was dragging on and we were searching for a solution to the problem, our country had defeated the adversary on the battlefield without a single American life being lost in combat, but the dictator Milosevic was hanging on. I invited the former Prime Minister of Russia to my house and took a risk in asking him to get personally involved, along with the head of Finland, to go to Belgrade and to take a set of proposals from the United States that would constitute basically a surrender by Serbia, but it was a calculated risk that paid off. Now, I could probably give you some other examples of decisions over the last 24 years. I have been in public service for 24 years, Jim, and throughout all that time, the people I have fought for have been the middle-class families. And I have been willing to stand up to powerful interests like the big insurance companies, the drug companies, the HMOs, the oil companies. They have good people and they play constructive roles sometimes, but sometimes they get too much power. I cast my lot with the people, even when it means that you have to stand up to some powerful interests who are trying to turn the the policies and the laws to their advantage. That's, you can see it in this campaign. The big drug companies support Governor Bush's prescription drug proposal. They oppose mine because they don't want to get Medicare involved because they're afraid that Medicare will negotiate lower prices for seniors who currently pay the highest prices of all.
Governor Bush?
Well, I've been standing up to big Hollywood, big trial lawyers. What was the question? It was about emergencies, wasn't it?
Well, it was about, well, yeah, okay.
You know, as governor, one of the things you have to deal with is catastrophe. I can remember the fires that swept Parker County, Texas. I remember the floods that swept our state. I remember going down to Del Rio, Texas. I've got to pay the administration a compliment. James Lee Witt of FEMA has done a really good job of working with governors during times of crisis. But that's the time when you're tested not only, it's time to test your mettle. It's the time to test your heart when you see people whose lives have been turned upside down. It broke my heart to go to the flood scene in Del Rio where a fellow and his family just got completely uprooted. The only thing I knew to do was to get aid as quickly as possible, which we did with state and federal help, and to put my arms around the man and his family and cry with him. But that's what governors do. Governors are oftentimes found in the front line of catastrophic situations.
New question. There can be all kinds of crises, Governor. It's a question for you. There could be a crisis, for instance, in the financial area.
Yeah.
The stock market could take a tumble. There could be a failure of a major financial institution. What is your general attitude toward government intervention in such events?
Well, it depends, obviously, but what I would do first and foremost is I would get in touch with the Federal Reserve Chairman, Alan Greenspan, to find out all the facts and all the circumstances. I would have my Secretary of Treasury be in touch with the financial centers, not only here but at home. I would make sure that key members of Congress were called in to discuss the gravity of the situation. And I would come up with a game plan to deal with it. That's what governors end up doing. We end up being problem solvers. We come up with practical, common sense solutions for problems that we're confronted with. And in this case, in case of a financial crisis, I would gather all the facts before I made the decision as to what the government ought or ought not to do.
Vice President Gore?
Yeah, first I want to compliment the governor on his response to those fires and floods in Texas. I accompanied James Lee Witt down to Texas when those fires broke out, and FEMA has been a major flagship project of our reinventing government efforts, and I agree, it works extremely well now. On the international financial crises that come up, my friend Bob Rubin, former Secretary of Treasury, is here. He's a very close advisor to me and a great friend in all respects. I have had a chance to work with him and Alan Greenspan and others on the crisis following the collapse of the Mexican peso, when the Asian financial crisis raised the risk of worldwide recession that could affect our economy. And now, of course, the euro's value has been dropping, but seems to be under control. But it started for me in the last 8 years when I had the honor of casting the tie-breaking vote to end the old economic plan here at home and put into place a new economic plan that has helped us to make some progress. 22 million new jobs and the greatest prosperity ever, but it's not good enough. And my attitude is, you ain't seen nothing yet. We need to do more and better.
So, Governor, would you agree there is no basic difference here on intervening, the federal government intervening in what might be seen by others to be a private financial crisis, if it's that severe?
No, there's no difference on that. There is a difference, though, as to what the economy has meant. I think the economy has meant more for the Gore and Clinton folks than the Gore and Clinton folks have meant for the economy. I think most of the economic growth that has taken place is a result of ingenuity and hard work and entrepreneurship. And that's the role of government, is to encourage that. But in terms of the response to the question, no.
Okay.
Can I comment on that?
You may.
See, you know, I think that the American people deserve credit for the great economy that we have, and it's their ingenuity. I agree with that. But, you know, they were working pretty hard 8 years ago, and they had ingenuity 8 years ago. The difference is we've got to new policy. And instead of concentrating on tax cuts mostly for the wealthy, I want tax cuts for the middle-class families, and I want to continue the prosperity and make sure that it enriches not just the few, but all of our families. Look, we have gone from the biggest deficits to the biggest surpluses. We've gone from a triple-dip recession during the previous 12 years to a tripling of the stock market. Instead of high unemployment, we've got the lowest African-American and lowest Latino unemployment rates ever in history, and 22 million new jobs. But it's not good enough. Too many people have been left behind. We have got to do much more, and the key is job training, education, investments in health care and education, the environment, retirement security, and incidentally, we have got to preserve Social Security, and I am totally opposed to diverting $1 out of every $6 away from the Social Security Trust Fund, as the governor has proposed, into the stock market. I want new incentives for savings and investment for the young couples who are working hard so they can save and invest on their own on top of Social Security, not at the expense of Social Security as the governor proposes.
2 points. One, a lot of folks are still waiting for that 1992 middle-class tax cut. I remember the Vice President saying, just give us a chance to get up there. We're going to make sure you get tax cuts. It didn't happen. And now he's having to say it again. It's just, they've had their chance to deliver a tax cut to you. Secondly, the surest way to bust this economy is to increase the role and the size of the federal government. The Senate Budget Committee did a study of the Vice President's expenditures. They've projected that it could conceivably bust the budget by $900 billion. That means he's either going to have to raise your taxes by $900 billion or go into the Social Security surplus for $900 billion. This is a plan that is going to increase the bureaucracy by 20,000 people. His targeted tax cut is so detailed, so much fine print, that it's going to require numerous IRS agents. No, we need somebody to simplify the code, to be fair, to continue prosperity by sharing some of the surplus with the people who pay the bills, particularly those at the bottom end of the economic ladder.
But if I could respond, Jim, what he's quoting is not the Senate Budget Committee. It is a partisan press release by the Republicans on the Senate Budget Committee that's not worth the government, the taxpayer-paid paper that it's printed on. Now, as for 20,000 new bureaucrats, as you call them, you know, the size of the federal government will go down in a Gore administration. In the Reinventing Government program, you just look at the numbers, it is 300,000 people smaller today than it was 8 years ago. Now, the fact is, you're going to have a hard time convincing folks that we were a whole lot better off 8 years ago than we are today. But that's not the question. The question is, will we be better off 4 years from now than we are today? And as for the surest way to threaten our prosperity, having a $1.9 trillion tax cut, almost half of which goes to the wealthy, and a $1 trillion Social Security privatization proposal is the surest way to put our budget into deficit, raise interest rates, and put our prosperity at risk.
I can't let the man continue with fuzzy math. It's $1.3 trillion, Mr. Vice President. It's going to go to everybody who pays taxes. I'm not going to be one of these kinds of presidents that said, you get tax relief and you don't. I'm not going to be a pick and chooser. What is fair is everybody who pays taxes ought to get relief.
I thought we cleared this up a while ago. New question on Social Security. Both of you have Social Security reform plans, and we could spend the rest of the evening and 2 or 3 other evenings talking about them in detail. We're not going to do that. But many experts, including Federal Reserve Chairman Greenspan, Vice President Gore, say that it will be impossible for either of you, essentially, to keep the system viable on its own during the coming baby boomer retirement onslaught without either reducing benefits or increasing taxes. Do you disagree?
I do disagree, because if we can keep our prosperity going, if we can continue balancing the budget and paying down the debt, then the strong economy keeps generating surpluses. And here's what I would do. Here's my plan. I will keep Social Security in a lockbox, and that pays down the national debt, and the interest savings I would put right back into Social Security. That extends the life of Social Security for 55 years. Now, I think that it's very important to understand that cutting benefits under Social Security means that people like Winifred Skinner from Des Moines, Iowa, who's here, would really have a much harder time, because there are millions of seniors who are living almost hand to mouth. And you talk about cutting benefits, I don't go along with it. I am opposed to it. I'm also opposed to a plan that diverts $1 out of every $6 away from the Social Security Trust Fund. You know, Social Security is a trust fund that pays the checks this year with the money that's paid into Social Security this year. The governor wants to divert $1 out of every $6 off into the stock market, which means that he would drain $1 trillion out of the Social Security Trust Fund over in this generation, over the next 10 years, and Social Security under that approach would go bankrupt within this generation. His leading advisor on this plan actually said that would be okay, because then the Social Security Trust Fund could start borrowing. It would borrow up to $3 trillion. Now, Social Security has never done that, and I don't think it should do that. I think it should stay in a lockbox, and I'll tell you this, I will veto anything that takes money out of Social Security for privatization or anything else other than Social Security.
Governor?
Well, I thought it was interesting that on the 2 minutes he spent about $1.5 million on my plan, which means he doesn't want you to know that what he's doing is loading up IOUs for future generations. He puts no real assets in the Social Security system. The revenues exceed the expenses in Social Security to the year 2015, which means all retirees are going to get the promises made. So for those of you who he wants to scare into the voting booth to vote for him, hear me loud and clear. A promise made will be a promise kept. And you bet we want to allow younger workers to take some of their own money. See, that's a difference of opinion. The Vice President thinks it's the government's money. The payroll taxes are your money. You ought to put it in prudent, safe investments so that $1 trillion over the next 10 years grows to be $3 trillion. The money stays within the Social Security system. It's a part of the Social Security system. He keeps claiming it's going to be out of Social Security. It's your money. It's a part of your retirement benefits. It's a fundamental difference between what we believe. I want you to have your own asset that you can call your own. I want you to have an asset that you can pass on from one generation to the next. I want to get a better rate of return for your own money than the paltry 2% that the current Social Security Trust gets today. So Mr. Greenspan missed an opportunity to say there's a third way, and that is to get a better rate of return on the Social Security monies coming into the trust. There's $2.3 trillion of surplus that we can use to make sure younger workers have a Social Security plan in the future, if we're smart, if we trust workers, and if we understand the power of the compounding rate of interest.
Here's the difference. I give a new incentive for younger workers to save their own money and invest their own money, but not at the expense of Social Security, on top of Social Security. My plan is Social Security plus. The governor's plan is Social Security minus. Your future benefits would be cut by the amount that's diverted into the stock market, and if you make bad investments, that's too bad. But even before then, the problem hits, because the money contributed to Social Security this year is an entitlement. That's how it works. And the money is used to pay the benefits for seniors this year. If you cut the amount going in, $1 out of every $6, then you have to cut the value of each check by $1 out of every $6 unless you come up with the money from somewhere else. I would like to know from the governor, I know we're not supposed to ask each other questions, but I'd be interested in knowing, does that $1 trillion come from the trust fund, or does it come from the rest of the budget?
No. There's enough money to pay seniors today in the current affairs of Social Security. The trillion comes from the surplus. Surplus is more money than needed. Let me tell you what your plan is. It's not Social Security plus, it's Social Security plus huge debt is what it is. You leave future generations with tremendous IOUs. It's time to have a leader that doesn't put off, tomorrow what we should do today. It's time to have somebody to step up and say, look, let's let younger workers take some of their own money and under certain guidelines invest it in the private markets. The safest of federal investments yields 4%. That's twice the amount of rate of return than the current Social Security trust does. There's a fundamental difference of opinion here, folks. Younger worker after younger worker. Here's my call that says I trust you. And you know what? The issue is changing because seniors now understand that the promise made will be a promise kept. But younger workers now understand we better have a government that trusts them. And that's exactly what I'm going to do.
Could I respond to that, Jim? This is a big issue. This is a big issue. Could we do another round on it?
We're almost out of time.
Well, just briefly, when FDR established Social Security, they didn't call them IOUs. They call it the full faith and credit of the United States. If you don't have trust in that, I do. And if you take it out of the surplus in the trust fund, that means the trust fund goes bankrupt in this generation within 20 years.
Go ahead.
This is a government that thinks a 2% rate of return on your money is satisfactory. It's not. This is a government that says younger workers can't possibly have their own asset. We need to think differently about the issue. We need to make sure our seniors get the promise made. But I'm going to tell you, if we don't trust younger workers to manage some of their own money with the Social Security surplus, to grow from $1 trillion to $3 trillion, it's going to be impossible to bridge the gap without what Mr. Gore's plan will do, causing huge payroll taxes or major benefit reductions.
New question.
Yes, sir.
Governor Bush, are there issues of character that distinguish you from Vice President Gore?
Well, man loves his wife, and I appreciate that a lot, and I love mine. And the man loves his family a lot, and I appreciate that because I love my family. I think the thing that discouraged me about the Vice President was uttering those famous words, no controlling legal authority. I felt like that there needed to be a better sense of responsibility of what was going on in the White House. I believe that they've moved that sign, the buck stops here from the Oval Office desk to the buck stops here on the Lincoln bedroom, and that's not good for the country. It's not right. We need to have a new look about how we conduct ourselves in office. There's a huge trust. I see it all the time when people come up to me and say, I don't want you to let me down again. And we can do better than the past administration has done. It's time for a fresh start. It's time for a new look. It's time for a fresh start after a season of cynicism. And so I don't know the man well, but I've been disappointed about how he and his administration has conducted the fundraising affairs. You know, going to a Buddhist temple and then claiming it wasn't a fundraiser is just not my view of responsibility.
Vice President Gore?
Well, I think we ought to attack our country's problems, not attack each other. I want to spend my time making this country even better than it is, not trying to make you out to be a bad person. You may want to focus on scandals. I want to focus on results. As I said a couple of months ago, I stand here as my own man, and I want you to see me for who I really am. Tipper and I have been married for 30 years. We became grandparents a year and a half ago. We've got 4 children. I have devoted 24 years of my life to public service, and I've said this before and I'll say it again. If you entrust me with the presidency, I may not be the most exciting politician, but I will work hard for you every day. I will fight for middle-class families and working men and women, and I will never let you down.
So, Governor, what are you saying when you mention the fundraising scandals or the fundraising charges that involved Vice President Gore? What are you saying that the voters should take from that that's relevant to this election?
I think they ought to factor it in when they make their decision in the voting booth. Who can do a better job? Pardon me?
In what way?
Well, you know, I think that people need to be held responsible for the actions they take in life.
Yeah.
I think that.
Go ahead. Excuse me.
Well, I think that's part of the need for a cultural change. We need to say that each of us need to be responsible for what we do, and people in the highest office of the land must be responsible for decisions they make in life. And that's the way I've conducted myself as governor of Texas, and that's the way I'll conduct myself as president of the United States, should I be fortunate enough to earn your vote.
Are you saying all of this is irrelevant, Vice President Gore, to this election?
No, I think the American people should take into account who we are as individuals, what our experience is, what our positions on the issues are, what our proposals are. I am asking you again to see me for who I really am. I'm offering you my own vision, my own experience, my own proposals. And incidentally, one of them is this. This current campaign financing system has not reflected credit on anybody in either party. And that's one of the reasons I've said before, and I'll pledge here tonight, if I'm president, the very first bill that Joe Lieberman and I will send to the United States Congress is the McCain-Feingold Campaign Finance Reform Bill. And the reason it's that important is that all of the other issues, whether prescription drugs for all seniors that are opposed by the drug companies, or the Patient's Bill of Rights to take the decisions away from the HMOs and give them to the doctors and nurses opposed by the HMOs and insurance companies, all of these other proposals are going to be a lot easier to get passed for the American people if we limit the influence of special interest money and give democracy back to the American people. And I wish Governor Bush would join me this evening in endorsing the McCain-Feingold Campaign Finance Reform Bill.
Governor Bush?
You know, this man has no credibility on the issue. As a matter of fact, I read in the New York Times where he said he co-sponsored the McCain-Feingold Campaign fundraising bill. But he wasn't in the Senate with Senator Feingold. And so, look, what you need to know about me is I'm going to uphold the law. I'm going to have an attorney general that enforces the law. That it's the time for campaign funding reform is after the election. This man has outspent me. The special interests are outspending me, and I am not going to lay down my arms in the middle of a campaign for somebody who has got no credibility on the issue.
Senator McCain said in, excuse me one sec, Vice President Gore. Senator McCain said in August, it doesn't matter which one of you is President of the United States in January, there's going to be blood on the floor of the United States Senate, and he's going to tie up the United States Senate until campaign finance reform is passed that includes a ban on soft money. First of all, would you support that effort by him, or would you sign a bill that is finally passed that included
I would support an effort to ban corporate soft money and labor union soft money so long as there was dues checkoff. I've campaigned on this ever since the primaries. I believe there needs to be instant disclosure on the internet as to who's given to whom. I think we need to fully enforce the law. I mean, I think we need to have an attorney general that says if laws are broken, we'll enforce the law. Be strict about it. Be firm about it.
Look, Governor Bush, you have attacked my character and credibility, and I am not going to respond in kind. I think we ought to focus on the problems and not attack each other. And one of the serious problems, hear me well, is that our system of government is being undermined by too much influence coming from special interest money. We have to get a handle on it. And like John McCain, I have learned from experience, and it's not a new position for me. 24 years ago, I supported full public financing of all federal elections. And anybody who thinks I'm just saying it'll be the first bill I send to the Congress, I want you to know I care passionately about this, and I will fight until it becomes law.
I want people to hear what he just said. He is for full public financing of congressional elections. I'm absolutely adamantly opposed to that. I don't want the government financing congressional elections.
I know.
And sorry.
I would just say on that wonderful note of disagreement, we have to stop here, and we want to go now to your closing statements. Governor Bush is first. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Jim. Thank the University of Massachusetts. Mr. Vice President, thank you. It's been a good, lively exchange. Obviously, we have huge differences of opinion. Mine is that I want to empower people in their own lives. I also want to go to Washington to get some positive things done. It's going to require a new spirit, a spirit of cooperation. It's going to require the ability of a Republican president to reach out across the partisan divide and to say to Democrats, let's come together to do what's right for America. It's been my record as governor of Texas. It'll be how I conduct myself if I'm fortunate enough to earn your vote as president of the United States. I want to finally get something done on Medicare. I want to make sure prescription drugs are available for all seniors. And I want seniors to have additional choices when it comes to choosing their health care plans. I want to finally get something done on Social Security. I want to make sure that seniors have the promise made will be a promise kept, but I want younger workers to be able to manage some of their own money, some of their own payroll taxes in the private sector under certain guidelines to get a better rate of return on your own money. I want to rebuild our military to keep the peace. I want to have a strong hand when it comes to the United States and world affairs. I don't want to try to put our troops in all places at all times. I don't want to be the world's policeman. I want to be the world's peacemaker by having a military of high morale and a military that's well equipped. I want to have anti-ballistic missile systems to protect ourselves and our allies from a rogue nation that may try to hold us hostage or blackmail a friend. I also want to make sure our education system fulfills its hope and promise. I've had a strong record of working with Democrats and Republicans in Texas to make sure no child is left behind. I understand the limited role of the federal government, but it can be a constructive role when it comes to reform by insisting that there be strong accountability systems. No, my intentions are to earn your vote and earn your confidence. I'm asking for your vote. I want you to be on my team, and for those of you working, thanks from the bottom of my heart. And for those of you making up your mind, I'd be honored to have your support.
Vice President Gore, 2 minutes.
I want to thank everybody who watched and listened tonight, because this is indeed a crucial time in American history. We're at a fork in the road. We have this incredible prosperity, but a lot of people have been left behind. And we have a very important decision to make. Will we use the prosperity to enrich all of our families and not just the few? One important way of looking at this is to ask, who are you going to fight for? Throughout my career in public service, I have fought for the working men and women of this country, middle-class families. Why? Because you are the ones who have the hardest time paying taxes, the hardest time making ends meet. You are the ones who are making car payments and mortgage payments and doing right by your kids, and a lot of times their powerful forces arrayed against you. And make no mistake about it, they do have undue influence in Washington, D.C., and it makes a difference if you have a president who will fight for you. I know one thing about the position of president. It's the only position in our Constitution that's filled by an individual who is given the responsibility to fight not just for one state or one district or the well-connected or wealthy, but to fight for all of the people, including especially those who most need somebody who will stand up and take on whatever powerful forces might stand in the way. There's a woman named Winifred Skinner here tonight from Iowa. I mentioned her earlier. She's 79 years old. She has Social Security. I'm not going to cut her benefits or support any proposal that would. She gets a small pension, but in order to pay for her prescription drug benefits, she has to go out 7 days a week, several hours a day, picking up cans. She came all the way from Iowa in a Winnebago with her poodle in order to attend here tonight. And I want to tell her, I am going to fight for a prescription drug benefit for all seniors, and I'm going to fight for the people of this country for a prosperity that benefits all.
And we will continue this dialogue next week on October the 11th at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. The format then will be more informal, more conversational, with the two candidates seated at a table with me. The third will be October 17th at Washington University in St. Louis, and that will follow a town hall type format. Also ahead, the day after tomorrow, on October 5th, there's the 90-minute debate between the Democratic candidate for Vice President, Senator Joe Lieberman, and the Republican candidate, former Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney. It will be held at Center College in Danville, Kentucky. The moderator will be Bernard Shaw of CNN. Thank you, Governor Bush, Vice President Gore. See you next week. And for now, from Boston, I'm Jim Lara. Thank you and good night.
For a little over an hour and a half now, the two major party candidates for president have had a vigorous, spirited exchange of views. Two sharply different visions, primarily on the issues on everything from Social Security to Medicare, tax cuts, the readiness of the military of the United States, Yugoslavia, the recent FDA approval of the abortion pill.
They haven't gotten things done in the last 8 years in Washington. I can do better. I'm joined now by Tim Russert as we watch the two families and their supporters there as they're pointing to their friends, advisors, and financial supporters who are here. Tim, it was clear that Vice President Gore was determined to, that's Frank Hunter, the Vice President's brother-in-law, was married to his late sister Nancy. Dodo Bush, who was the governor's sister, and I think his brother Jeb Bush was up there as well. Tim, Vice President Gore obviously thinks that he has a hot button in this tax cut. It's not just the size of it, but where the benefits will go.
Absolutely, Tom, and that's why he tried throughout this debate to keep George Bush on the defensive. Al Gore knows that in order for Bush to win this race, he has to provide the American people a rationale to change the leadership during good times. And if he can keep him explaining his tax cut and then fold in Medicare and Social Security and prescription drugs and abortion, he can keep him in a position where it's very difficult for George Bush to emerge and say, I can be the dominant force on this stage.
Two things surprised me. One was that it took the Texas governor 75 minutes to raise the cost of all the proposals that Al Gore has been putting before the American public. And secondly, both in terms of Social Security and the plan that the vice president is proposing and the tax cut that the governor is proposing, those experts across the political spectrum are saying they're being wildly optimistic about this. This $25 trillion surplus that we kept hearing about tonight is by no means certain at all.
There's no guarantee, Tom. And when Governor Bush talks about his tax plan and Al Gore talks about his spending plans, they assume all this money is going to be there. And the most interesting thing is what happens? What happens if there is this world economic crisis or this oil crisis and the money disappears? How do you pay for those programs? Can you afford the tax cuts?
Tim, we're seeing some familiar faces down there. We just saw the Texas governor. There's Vice President Al Gore with Jesse Jackson. He was there with Senator Edward M. Kennedy. This is his backyard, of course. We've got a late poll from John Zogby tonight showing that Gore's at 46, Bush at 41%, Ralph Nader at 5%. He couldn't get in here, by the way, even though that he did have a credential, but he was turned away by the Presidential Commission on Debates. That was taken before the debate, we hasten to point out. But we want to go to Tampa, Florida now, where NBC's Sarah James has been assembling a group of undecided voters, and they are going to be the critical vote in all of this. In Florida, 25 electoral votes. The governor is Jeb Bush, who's the brother, of course, of Texas Governor George W. Bush. And Sarah, you've got all those undecided there. Did anyone change their mind tonight or go one way or the other?
We are anxious to know, Tom, because, of course, these are the very voters that both Bush and Gore most want to reach. They are on the fence. They have been listening closely, taking notes, making up their minds as they watch. And, in fact, this group which we've assembled, it looks very much like what you would find of a cross-section of undecided voters in this part of the state. So, without further ado, let me ask you all, show of hands if you can, was there anything that happened tonight that helped you make up your mind? Raise your hand if there was. Any moment tonight? No one defined. You did? Yeah. Barbara?
I certainly like all through the whole debate Gore's experience, because he's been on the Hill as a senator, as a vice president. That means a lot to me. It's one thing to run a state. I mean, all Bush did was talk about Texas. That's fine.
But you wanted to hear about Gore and his national message. I've got a lot of experience.
And he's been there, seen it, done that. And
how about any of the rest of you? Did that message from Gore resonate, or was there something else that stuck out in your minds? Yes, Chris?
I don't know if that stuck out in my mind as much as there seemed to be some self-promotion and some rhetoric between the two of them where they kind of put words into each other's mouths. I didn't get from the debate that Bush attacked Gore personally, although he tried to make it look that way at the end of the debate. I thought he was attacking the administration over the last 8 years, not necessarily him personally.
All right, well, I want to really put you all on the spot, and I want a show of hands. You all came into this undecided. Who do you think won? How many of you, show of hands, think that Bush won this debate? All right, and how many of you think Gore won this debate? All right, let's talk to some of you Gore voters. Scott Revere, does that mean that you would be interested in voting for Gore based on what you heard in this debate?
I'm a little bit more leaning towards that side of things right now. I'll wait to see how things play out in the next two debates.
What was it that you heard that made you decide maybe Gore is what you want to do?
Experience, sincerity. He wasn't going on the personal attack. It seemed like how Bush was going there a little bit more. All
right, let's talk about some of you who thought that Bush might be your vote. Was that you, Terry? Did you say? I thought I saw your hand go up. Terry Castro, you own your own computer business. What was it that you heard that made you think Bush?
That Governor Bush wants to go to Washington to build a coalition. we've had such divisiveness, we've had such mean-spiritedness the past 8 years, and destruction of people and ideals, that you're either on this side of the fence or you're on that side. He wants to go to Washington to build a coalition among everyone on the Hill.
Let me ask you very quickly, Carl, we just have a couple of seconds left. I saw you shaking your head over the back and forth. Was that getting to you?
It's basically the same political rhetoric that we've had pretty much since I've been alive. I mean, my earliest remembrance is Kennedy. It's basically the same thing on an ongoing basis. I disagree with her to a certain extent on Bush. I don't know that he's going to change anything. I mean, it's...
Trish, I'm seeing you shake your head. You don't believe that. You don't buy that.
It's not just that. I go back to the fact that Bush mentions that he's been there for 8 years. We have some being a nurse, some serious Medicaid issues where the elderly and the seniors are not able to pay for their medication. Half is wonderful, but half of medication being $100, $50, you have 5 or 6 medications.
So based on what you heard tonight, Trish,
I believe that the past 8 years, this issue has not been taken care of. Maybe it is time to have something new and come in and take care of the issue.
So given what you've heard tonight, you might go for Bush.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So this, Tom, then is a cross-section, just a sampling of what we're hearing from these undecided voters as they now give their opinions for the first time after hearing this debate.
Thanks very much, Sarah, James, and Tim. I think that's been really emblematic of what we've been seeing all campaign year long. They're not going to make up their mind, and probably until the closing week of this campaign. These two candidates still have to earn those votes in the next 2 debates and every day between now and that first Tuesday in November.
There's no deep, abiding passion for either of these two men, Tom, and if you take the undecideds and the soft support, we still have, we saw tonight, 1 out of every 4 voters who still hasn't made up their mind, a firm commitment. They want to watch the next 2 debates. That's good news for us.
That's right, indeed. About 40% of the voters in this country are for one candidate or the other, and then that critical 20% in between, I think, is kind of amoeba-like. It keeps moving around and breaking up into different parts and then reforming itself, and that's likely to be the dynamic between now and Election Day, 5 weeks away. NBC's Lisa Myers is the captain of our Truth Squad here tonight. She was keeping track of all the various claims that were made by the 2 candidates, and we're going to ask her if she can to do a kind of a political accounting for us tonight. Lisa, any wild exaggerations or understatements?
Well, no, certainly not many understatements, Tom. Our crack team of political researchers and producers have been working throughout the debate, checking the candidates' facts. Did they distort, mislead, say something less than the full truth? Now, both the campaigns also have had their own truth squads working overtime tonight on the internet. At this hour, the Bush camp claims Gore was less than truthful 27 times. The Gore camp claims that Bush was less than truthful 16 times. As for our own team, well, what we found is that both candidates took liberties with the truth. Let's start on the issue of the budget surplus because that's so important.
I want to take 1/2 of the surplus and dedicate it to Social Security, 1/4 of the surplus for important projects, and I want to send 1/4 of the surplus back to the people who pay the bills.
Well, that's not quite right. It's true that Bush does set aside half the surplus for Social Security, but of the remaining money, about $2 or $3 goes for tax cuts compared to every dollar he spends for education, prescription drugs, or new projects. Now let's look at what Gore said, taking issue with the charge that he would use the surplus to massively expand government.
Under my proposal, for every dollar that I propose in spending for things like education and health care, I will put another dollar into middle-class tax cuts. And for every dollar that I spend in those 2 categories, I'll put $2 toward paying down the national debt.
Well, that's not quite right either. Experts say Gore actually would put at least $2 into new government programs for every dollar he spends on middle-class tax cuts. One more note on the surplus, Tom, and that's a point you and Tim made, which is that experts say that both of these candidates grossly overpromise and would spend a lot more money on taxes and new programs than is likely to occur in any future surplus. Now let's look at the heated debate which occurred on the issue of prescription drugs.
95% of all seniors would get no help whatsoever under my opponent's plan for the first 4 or 5 years.
Wait a minute, it's just totally false for him to stand up here and say that.
Well, Well, Bush is right. That is false. Beginning next year, he would give $48 billion to the states to help as many as 9 million low-income seniors buy prescription drugs. That's many more than the 5% Bush claims. Gore claims. Gore is correct, though, that most seniors under Bush's plan would have to wait at least a couple of years for much help in buying their prescription drugs, Tom.
Thank you very much. NBC's Lisa Myers tonight, the captain of our Truth Squad, once again, as she appears almost every election year, Tim, that old seductress Rosie Scenario is back. And we'll have additional coverage from here in Boston in just a moment.
Decision 2000 on MSNBC. The choice is yours.
Tonight's debate is brought to you by Fidelity Investments.
I will capitalize on the potential of tomorrow's promising companies.
Many promising companies are showing signs of future success today. Growing earnings and revenue are two things to look for. If you're willing to assume more risk, you may see higher returns.
The Fidelity Growth Company Fund looks for companies that have above-average growth potential. See what Fidelity Money Management Excellence can do for you. Get the fact kit today. Call 1-800-FIDELITY or visit fidelity.com.
Voices from Main Street is getting the voice of small business heard. Already, thousands of you have spoken out through online chats, live events, and polls. According to our survey, the #1 public issue for small business owners is education and training. This is closely followed by healthcare costs and tax reform. Where do you stand? Log on to AmericanExpress.com right now and make your views known. Join us, and together we can make the voice of small business heard.
Okay, we want our customers to know that we're dropping prices. So we're going to put these up all over the store.
Ah, construction thing.
We're dropping prices over here and on all of these and here too. Now that says lower prices. Hey, what's with the hard hats?
It's for falling prices.
What's that?
It's a backhoe for clearing away old prices.
I like the hard hats.
Yeah.
Want lower prices? Staples. Yeah, we've got that.
Watch the ripples change the size, but never leave the stream.
In today's net economy, companies are struggling to change, struggling with the complexities of e-business, with making intranets, extranets, and the internet work together across any platform around the world. Well, now it can all work together as one net. With Net Services software from Novell, the power to change.
We're back here in Boston. We've seen the conclusion now of this first debate, 95 minutes altogether, between Vice President Al Gore and Texas Governor George W. Bush. There is a continuing and enduring tradition after these debates. It's called the Spin Room, where political correspondents and pundits gather, and then they are spun, in a matter of speaking, by the advisors and those people who are friendly to the two candidates. Let's go now first to NBC's Claire Shipman, who, of course, has been covering Vice President Al Gore's campaign. Claire, what's the spin out of there tonight?
Well, Tom, the spinners are indeed out in full force, and on both sides, surprise, surprise, everybody's claiming it was a victory, and it was obviously. There was no real obvious winner, and I think you're going to hear back from everybody behind me that they think their guy won. My interpretation, talking about Vice President Gore, is the following. What he really, really wanted to do tonight was stay focused on the issues, try to swamp George W. Bush with facts. They feel he did that, and he did do that for the most part. Didn't want him to go negative. He tried to avoid that. In fact, even turned the tables on Bush, saying, you're the one who attacked my character and credibility. I'm not going to do that. So that's what they're saying so far.
All right, thanks very much, Claire Shipman. David Gregory is covering the Bush campaign. David, anybody whispering anything in your ear from the Bush campaign at this point?
Well, you know, there was always a feeling. Their biggest expectation would be that if it was even coming in, that after this debate it'd be even coming out. And I think that a lot of them are going to feel that that expectation was met by Governor Bush tonight. he had a crucial test, had to prove that he was up to the job. There were a lot more questions about Governor Bush than about the vice president in this particular arena, and certainly what the spinners are saying and what was plainly obvious is that the Texas governor did have a grasp on balance of these issues that were debated tonight. It was a serious exchange between the two of them, and that's going to be seen as a victory.
Thanks very much, NBC's David Gregory. And in Kentucky tonight, the Democratic vice presidential candidate, Joe Lieberman, is already in place preparing for his debate in Danville on Thursday night against former Wyoming Congressman Dick Cheney. Let me begin with you, if I can, Senator Lieberman, by asking if you were surprised that George W. Bush was on the defensive for the first 30 minutes or so when it came to this whole question of the size of his tax cut.
Well, it was surprising, but I think what happened here tonight is that Al Gore was very strong, very factual, very fair, and very presidential. And that is why I think Governor Bush was, in fact, on the defensive for a good part of the debate tonight. Governor Bush never really responded to Al Gore's contention, which is a fact, that 43% of the Bush tax cut goes to the top 1% of the American people. And of course, that's not fair and not the way to invest the surplus in continuing our prosperity, making it work for more of America's families. I thought the vice president was superb tonight. I'm proud to be his running mate. I thought he was great.
I'm somehow not surprised to hear all that, Senator Lieberman.
Well, Chris, I'm trying to be very dispassionate in my judgment. We'll see how the reaction is.
But already the Bush campaign is saying, how can Vice President Al Gore and Joe Lieberman say that they're best equipped to reform campaign finance in America, given what we've been through in the last 8 years? And didn't Governor Bush score points when he said, if you wanted to do something about prescription drugs, if you wanted to do something about Social Security, you've had 2 terms in which to do it?
Well, on campaign finance, the important thing to say is only Al Gore and I support Republican John McCain and Democrat Russ Feingold's campaign finance reform bill. George Bush opposes it and will veto it if it passes. On the promises made, listen, this last 8 years has been a time when we've turned deficits into surpluses, when we've cut the crime rate, when we reform welfare. This has been I think you'd have a hard time finding many people in America who would say, to answer Ronald Reagan's question, that they're not better off now than they were 8 years ago. Is there more to do? Of course there is. And this surplus allows us to do some of the things that we've not been able to do before, like give a good solid prescription drug benefit through Medicare to our senior citizens.
Senator Lieberman, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thanks,
Your counterpart in the debate on Thursday night is Dick Cheney. He's in Montgomery, Ohio at this moment, and he has watched all of this. Let me ask you, Mr. Cheney, was there any moment in this debate when you raised your voice to the television set toward Al Gore?
Yes, there, as a matter of fact, there was, Tom, but I'm... those are private moments, and in the tone and spirit of wanting to create a new tone in Washington, I prefer to talk about my great pride in what George Bush did tonight. I thought he was very effective.
I was surprised that it took the governor's 75 minutes to raise the cost of the Gore campaign proposals that he's been putting out there thus far.
You mean the campaign finance question?
No, not the campaign finance question. The whole cost of the many programs that the vice president has put forward.
Well, there's a lot to talk about. We'll probably hear more about that in the next 2 debates, but the fact that the Senate Budget Committee has counted up all of the Gore promises, and by their calculation, they've already spent $900 billion more than we'll have in the total surplus in the next 10 years.
After tonight, what is going to be your top priority when you debate Joe Lieberman on Thursday night in Danville, Kentucky?
It's a tremendous opportunity, Tom, to get access to millions of Americans, to have the opportunity to talk about what we want to do as a ticket, Governor Bush and myself, if we're successful. I'm sure Joe and will do an effective job on behalf of the Democrats in terms of laying out their proposals. But there really are major differences here, and hopefully there are millions of Americans out there who are going to engage in thinking about how they want to vote now as we come down to the closing weeks of the campaign, and the debate, I think, will be an important part of helping lay out those choices.
Do you think that you're getting traction in your campaign on this whole attack on military preparedness on the part of the Clinton-Gore administration, or are you putting yourself in a perilous position when the Vice President can say, listen, we have the best trained military in the world, and our adversaries must know that?
Well, there's no question but what I have enormous respect for the U.S. military, Tom. After all, I led them for 4 years through Desert Storm and to the end of the Cold War. The fact of the matter is, though, that all the trend lines are in the wrong direction. And while we're very strong today, we cannot maintain that strength if we can't retain a first-class force. We have to get people who want to re-enlist, for example. We've got to have modern equipment. We've got to provide the troops with the resources they need to do the job we ask them to do for us, and that has not been happening. Now, there's a reason why General Chuck Krulak, Commandant of the Marine Corps, Ron Fogelman, Air Force Chief of Staff, Jay Johnson, Chief of Naval Operations, all of these men recently retired, now private citizens, have endorsed Governor Bush and myself, even though they were all appointed on Bill Clinton and Al Gore's watch. The fact of the matter is, anybody who has a family today serving in the U.S. military knows we're in trouble, knows we need to turn it around, and this is an important issue in this campaign.
Thanks very much, Dick Cheney. We'll be watching you on Thursday night from Danville, Kentucky in your debate against Joe Lieberman.
Thanks, Tom.
Tim Russert, it seems to me that the most instructive voices that we heard tonight were in Tampa, Florida with Sarah James, the undecided voters who were not moved dramatically one way or the other. I suppose if we did a quick count looking at that again, more of them said they thought that Governor Bush won the debate tonight than did Al Gore, but none of them seemed to be terribly enthusiastic about either man. They're going to wait and see.
They're not locked in. This race is still very fluid and wide open. Tom, it's curious because George Bush knew he went into this debate likable, but he wanted to be perceived as more knowledgeable. Al Gore knew he was perceived as knowledgeable, wanted to come out of the debate more likable. Bush had approved capacity to govern. Gore had approved character to govern. Those undecided voters are going to tell us who succeeded. Tonight, it's still not clear. And that's what's so wonderful about this process, about these debates.
And that's what makes presidential politics so exciting, not just for all of us who do this, but for all of you as well, because after all, it's our common future at stake. Thursday night, Danville, Kentucky, then next week in Wake Forest, and then we go to Washington University in St. Louis. I'm Tom Brokaw. For all of us at NBC News, thank you for joining us, the first debate of Campaign 2000.
Mentioned, if you're happy with the system, you can stay in it. But there's a lot of procedures that have not kept up in Medicare with the current times. There's no prescription drug benefits, there's no drug therapies, there's no preventing medicines, there's no vision care. I mean, we need to have a modern system to help seniors. And the idea of supporting a federally controlled 132,000-page document bureaucracy as being a compassionate way for seniors and the only compassionate source of care for seniors is just not my vision. I believe we ought to give seniors more options. I believe we ought to make the system work better. But I know this. I know it's going to require a different kind of leader to go to Washington to say to both Republicans and Democrats, let's come together. You've had your chance, Vice President. You've been there for 8 years, and nothing has been done. And my point is that my plan not only trusts seniors with options, my plan sets aside $3.4 trillion for Medicare over the next 10 years. My plan also says it's going to require a new approach in Washington, D.C. It's going to require somebody who can work across the partisan divide.
If I could respond to that, Jim, under my plan, I will put Medicare in an ironclad lockbox and prevent the money from being used for anything other than Medicare. The governor has declined to endorse that idea, even though the Republican as well as Democratic leaders of Congress have endorsed it. I'd be interested if he would this evening say that he would put Medicare in a lockbox. I don't think he will, because under his plan, if you work out the numbers, $100 billion comes out of Medicare just for the wealthiest 1% in the tax cut. Now, here is the difference. Some people who say the word reform actually mean cuts. under the governor's plan, if you kept the same fee-for-service that you have now under Medicare, your premiums would go up by between 18 and 47%, and that's the study of the congressional plan that he's modeled his proposal on by the Medicare actuaries. Let me just give you one quick example. There's a man here tonight named George McKinney from Milwaukee. He's 70 years old. He has high blood pressure. His wife has heart trouble. They have income of $25,000 a year. They cannot pay for their prescription drugs, and so they're some of the ones that go to Canada regularly in order to get their prescription drugs. Under my plan, half of their costs would be paid right away. Under Governor Bush's plan, they would get not one penny for 4 to 5 years, and then they would be forced to go into an HMO or to an insurance company and ask them for coverage, but there'd be no limit on the premiums or the deductibles or any of the terms and conditions.
I cannot let this go by, the old-style Washington politics. We're going to scare you in the voting booth. Under my plan, the man gets immediate help with prescription drugs. It's called immediate helping hand. Instead of squabbling and finger-pointing, he gets immediate help. Let me say something. Now, I understand.
Excuse me,
Jim,
our
can
3.5 minutes is up, but we'll finish
Can I make one other point?
Wait a minute.
They get $25,000 a year income. That makes them ineligible.
Look, this is a man, he's got great numbers. He talks about numbers. I'm beginning to think not only did he invent the internet, but he invented the calculator. It's fuzzy math. It's trying to scare people in the voting booth. Under my tax plan that he continues to criticize, I set a third. No, the federal government should take no more than a third of anybody's check. But I also dropped the bottom rate from 15% to 10%. Because by far the vast majority of the help goes to people at the bottom end of the economic ladder. If you're a family of 4 in Massachusetts making $50,000, you get a 50% cut in the federal income taxes you pay. It's from $4,000 to about $2,000. Now the difference in our plans is I want that $2,000 to go to you.
All right, let me.
And the Vice President would like
each other directly. There will be no opening statements, but each candidate may have up to 2 minutes for a closing statement. The questions and the subjects were chosen by me alone. I have told no one from the 2 campaigns or the commission or anyone else involved what they are. There's a small audience in the hall tonight. They are not here to participate, only to listen. I have asked and they have agreed to remain silent for the next 90 minutes, except for right now, when they will applaud as we welcome the 2 candidates, Governor Bush and Vice President Gore. And now the first question, as determined by a flip of a coin, it goes to Vice President Gore. Vice President Gore, you have questioned whether Governor Bush has the experience to be President of the United States. What exactly do you mean?
Well, Jim, first of all, I would like to thank the sponsors of this debate and the people of Boston for hosting the debate. I'd like to thank Governor Bush for participating, and I'd like to say I'm happy to be here with Tipper and our family. I have actually not questioned Governor Bush's experience. I have questioned his proposals, and here's why. I think this is a very important moment for our country. We have achieved extraordinary prosperity, and in this election, America has to make an important choice. Will we use our prosperity to enrich not just the few, but all of our families? I believe we have to make the right and responsible choices. If I'm entrusted with the presidency, here are the choices that I will make. I'll balance the budget every year. I will pay down the national debt. I will put Medicare and Social Security in a lockbox and protect them. And I will cut taxes for middle-class families. I believe it's important to resist the temptation to squander our surplus. If we make the right choices, we can have a prosperity that endures and enriches all of our people. If I'm entrusted with the presidency, I will help parents and strengthen families. Because, you know, if we have prosperity that grows and grows, we still won't be successful unless we strengthen families. By, for example, ensuring that children can always go to schools that are safe, by giving parents the tools to protect their children against cultural pollution. I will make sure that we invest in our country and our families. And I mean investing in education, health care, the environment, and middle-class tax cuts and retirement security. That's my agenda, and that's why I think that it's not just a question of experience.
Governor Bush, 1 minute rebuttal.
Well, we do come from different places. I come from West Texas. I've been a governor. A governor is the chief executive officer and learns how to set agendas. And I think you're going to find the difference reflected in our budgets. I want to take 1/2 of the surplus and dedicate it to Social Security, 1/4 of the surplus for important projects, and I want to send 1/4 of the surplus back to the people who pay the bills. I want everybody who pays taxes to have their tax rates cut. Now that stands in contrast to my worthy opponent's plan, which will increase the size of government dramatically.
In 1 hour, Al Gore and George W. Bush will face off against each other for the first time. Two men going 90 minutes in front of a nationally televised audience that may go as high as 90 million viewers at some point during the hour and a half. Coming as it does during an interesting time in this race, with our MSNBC, Reuters news agency, Zogby tracking poll showing Al Gore cracking through the margin of error, but just barely 46-40 against George W. Bush. Good evening to you. I'm Brian Williams. I am joined by the host of Hardball, Chris Matthews. Chris, let's get right to it. What does both guys have to do tonight in this debate?
They have to play their strengths, as any politician has to, and they have to protect their weaknesses. The strengths for Al Gore are clear. The strongest American economy, perhaps in the history of the world. He can brag about that tonight as he's never done before, and it's a good time to do that. He can also take advantage of the positions he's taken on issues which are very popular. Prescription drugs for senior citizens, college tuition tax credits for working families who have kids in college. Very strong stuff. He can sell all that tonight. George W. Bush has got to sell the fact that he's an entrepreneur. He believes in the free enterprise system. He's a Reaganite guy who believes the government does not produce jobs, the private sector does.
I know you were laughing during Hardball tonight that expectations for George W. could not be managed any lower by his surrogates.
I believe that they put out a brilliant spin tonight that the man is lucky to be able to get through tonight without drooling, when in fact he's quite capable of doing a spectacular performance tonight. Anyone who's spent any time with George Bush knows he has one big advantage over Al Gore.
Tom Brokaw as our coverage continues.
From NBC News, Decision 2000, the presidential debates. From the University of Massachusetts in Boston, here is Tom Brokaw.
Good evening, everyone. I'm here with my colleague, our Washington bureau chief and moderator of Meet the Press, Tim Russert, and Tim on that stage right behind us tonight. Texas Governor George W. Bush and Vice President Al Gore will meet in the first of 3 debates between now and Election Day, and that's just 5 weeks away. When they walk onto that stage momentarily, the Vice President and the Governor will be facing 90 minutes of questions and rebuttals before a national television audience and an audience of their family and invited guests in this hall. We're told that Ralph Nader, the Green Party presidential candidate, has been attempting to get in here tonight on a ticket that may have been given to him by a student. We don't know whether that's been resolved yet. The candidates, their handlers, pundits, and kibitzers of all stripes have been attempting to raise expectations, lower them, second-guess them, and prejudge the outcome. But the fact is that we don't know at this point, and when it's over, you will be the judge, especially those of you who still have not settled on a candidate. The candidates have spent the weekend doing dress rehearsals with their advisors and family, going through mock debates, trying out outlines and second-guessing the opposition. The moderator, questioner tonight, Jim Lehrer of PBS, the highly respected host of the NewsHour.
Good evening from the Clark Athletic Center at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. I'm Jim Lara of the NewsHour on PBS, and I welcome you to the first of 3 90-minute debates between the Democratic candidate for president, Vice President Al Gore, and the Republican candidate, Governor George W. Bush of Texas. The debates are sponsored by the Commission on Presidential Debates, and they will be conducted within formats and rules agreed to by the Commission and the 2 campaigns. Tonight's will have the candidates at podiums. No answer to a question can exceed 2 minutes. Rebuttals are limited to 1 minute. But as moderator, I have the option to follow up and to extend any particular give and take another 3.5 minutes. But even then, no single answer can exceed 2 minutes. The candidates, under their rules, may not question
healthy people.
Governor Bush, you have a question. This is a companion question to the question I asked Vice President Gore. You have questioned whether Vice President Gore has demonstrated the leadership qualities necessary to be President of the United States. What do you mean by that?
Well, here's what I've said, Jim. I've said that 8 years ago they campaigned on prescription drugs for seniors. And 4 years ago they campaigned on getting prescription drugs for seniors. And now they're campaigning on getting prescription drugs for seniors. It seems like they can't get it done. Now, they may blame other folks, but it's time to get somebody in Washington who's going to work with both Republicans and Democrats to get some positive things done when it comes to our seniors. And so what I've said is there's been some missed opportunities. They've had a chance. They've had a chance to form consensus. I've got a plan on Medicare, for example, this 2-stage plan that says we're going to have immediate help for seniors and what I call immediate helping hand, a $48 billion program. But I also want to say to seniors, if you're happy with Medicare the way it is, fine, you can stay in the program. But we're going to give you additional choices, just like they give federal employees in the Federal Employee Health Plan. Federal employees have got a variety of choices from which to choose, so should seniors. And my point has been, as opposed to politicizing an issue like Medicare, in other words, holding it up as an issue, hoping somebody bites and then try to clobber them over the head with it for political purposes, this year, in the year 2000, it's time to say, let's get it done once and for all. And that's what I have been critical about the administration for. Same in Social Security. I think there was a good opportunity to bring Republicans and Democrats together to reform the Social Security system so the seniors will never go without. Those on Social Security today will have their promise made. But also to give younger workers the option at their choice of being able to manage some of their own money in the private sectors to make sure there's a Social Security system around tomorrow. There's a lot of young workers at our rallies we go to that when they hear that I'm going to trust them at their option to be able to manage under certain guidelines some of their own money to get a better rate of return so that they'll have a retirement plan in the future, they begin to nod their heads, and they want a different attitude in Washington.
1 minute rebuttal, Vice President Gore.
Well, Jim, under my plan, all seniors will get prescription drugs under Medicare. The governor has described Medicare as a government HMO. It's not, and let me explain the difference. Under the Medicare prescription drug proposal I'm making, here's how it works. You go to your own doctor, and your doctor chooses your prescription, and no HMO or insurance company can take those choices away from you. Then you go to your own pharmacy, you fill the prescription, and Medicare pays half the cost. If you're in a very poor family or if you have very high costs, Medicare will pay all the costs. A $25 premium and much better benefits that you could possibly find in the private sector. Now here's the contrast. 95% of all seniors would get no help whatsoever under my opponent's plan for the first 4 or 5 years. Now, one thing I don't understand, Jim, is why is it that the wealthiest 1% get their tax cuts the first year, but 95% of seniors have to wait 4 to 5 years before they get a single penny?
Governor?
I guess my answer to that is the man's running on Metascare, trying to frighten people in the voting booth. That's just not the way I think, and that's just not my intentions, and it's not my plan. I want all seniors to have prescription drugs in Medicare. We need to reform Medicare. There's been an opportunity to do so, but this administration has failed to do it. And so seniors are going to have not only a Medicare plan where the poor seniors will have their prescription drugs paid for, but there will be a variety of options. The current system today has meant a lot for a lot of seniors, and I really appreciate the intentions of the current system. And as His plan is 3 times larger than President Clinton's proposed plan 8 years ago. It's a plan that will have 200 new programs as well, or expanded programs. It'll create 20,000 new bureaucrats. In other words, it empowers Washington. And tonight you're going to hear that my passion and my vision is to empower Americans to be able to make decisions for themselves in their own lives.
So I take it by your answer then, Mr. Vice President, that in your an interview recently with the New York Times, when you said that you questioned whether or not Governor Bush was experienced enough to be president, you were talking about strictly policy differences.
Yes, Jim. I said that his tax cut plan, for example, raises the question of whether it's the right choice for the country. And let me give you an example of what I mean. Under Governor Bush's tax cut proposal, he would spend more money on tax cuts for the wealthiest 1% than all of the new spending that he proposes for education, health care, prescription drugs, and national defense all combined. Now, I think those are the wrong priorities. Now, under my proposal, for every dollar that I propose in spending for things like education and health care, I will put another dollar into middle-class tax cuts. And for every dollar that I spend in those 2 categories, I'll put $2 toward paying down the national debt. I think it's very important to keep the debt going down and completely eliminate it. And I also think it's very important to go to the next stage of welfare reform. Our country has cut the welfare rolls in half. I've fought hard from my days in the Senate and as Vice President to cut the welfare rolls, and we've moved millions of people in America into good jobs. But it's now time for the next stage of welfare reform and include fathers and not only mothers.
We're going to get to a lot of those. Yes, go ahead, Governor.
Well, let me just say that obviously tonight we're going to hear some phony numbers about what I think and what we ought to do. People need to know that over the next 10 years there's going to be $25 trillion of revenue that comes into our Treasury. We anticipate spending $21 trillion. And my plan says, why don't we pass $1.3 trillion of that back to the people who pay the bills? Surely we can afford 5% of the $25 trillion that are coming to the Treasury to the hard-working people who pay the bills. There's a difference of opinion. My opponent thinks the government, the surplus is the government's money. That's not what I think. I think it's the hard-working people in America's money, and I want to share some of that money with you. So you've got more money to build and save and dream for your families. It's a difference of opinion. It's the difference between government making decisions for you and you getting more of your money to make decisions for yourself.
Jim?
So when you, let me just follow up one quick question. When you...
A lot of experience, but so do I. And I've been the chief executive officer of the 2nd biggest state in the union. I've had a proud record of working with both Republicans and Democrats, which is what our nation needs. We need somebody who can come up to Washington and say, look, let's forget all the politics and all the finger pointing and get some positive things done on Medicare and prescription drugs and Social Security. And so I take him for his word.
Jim, if I could just
quick,
respond.
and we need to move on. Yes, sir.
I know that. The governor used the phrase phony numbers. But if you look at the plan and add the numbers up, these numbers are correct. He spends more money for tax cuts for the wealthiest 1% than all of his new spending proposals for health care, prescription drugs, education, and national defense all combined. I agree that the surplus is the American people's money. It's your money. That's why I don't think we should give nearly half of it to the wealthiest 1%, because the other 99% have had an awful lot to do with building this surplus and our prosperity.
Our 3.5 minutes is up. New question.
I hope it's about